This is a hybrid meeting. Currently in person is Jane Nevin-Smith, Molly Keegan, and myself, Randy Iser. We are expecting the other two members anytime. In accordance with Mass General Law, Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, signed by the governor on February 15th, 2022, I announce that this meeting of the Select Board is being recorded by Hadley Media, the Select Board's office via Zoom, and ask if there is anyone present who is also recording this meeting. Let the minutes reflect that nobody else has indicated that they are recording this meeting. Let's jump right in. Okay, we have new business, item 2.1, union contract approval, firefighter union, IAFF local 5486.
Shall review this in an executive session. This is just bringing it out for approval in open session. Sorry, I know you could have said that.
Anybody have any?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, motion to approve by Jane, second by Molly. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Now we're doing town administrator interviews. Item 2.2. No, you can't do that.
You need to tell her that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an open meeting. Okay, so we're gonna.
So while we're waiting for the other two select board members to arrive, we did schedule about a half an hour for you to talk with John, ask any questions that you'd like to discuss how the interview is going to work. I know we've been over this a couple of times, but you know, there may be some specifics that you'd like to get into with him before we get into the first interview at 4 p.m. So you have any questions or you want to discuss a few things, have at it.
Sure, maybe it'd be, Randy, would it be helpful to just have John give us a quick overview?
I think so. My thoughts were that he can tell us how he's going to run his portion of it, and then when he's done, if we have any additional questions, that's
Great.
Sound appropriate?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Petrin, Community Paradigm. So thank you for having me here today for assistance with the interviews. We were hired by the town several months ago now to assist facilitating the search process for your next town administrator. And as you're aware, we put together a position statement. We worked with, various members of the board, department heads, and so on. We put together that position statement, and then we recruited for the position. Worked with a 7-member screening committee. So I do want to thank the members of the screening committee. It was an excellent screening committee to work with. Two of the members I hear right now. We also had assistants from staff. So it was an excellent screening committee to work with. And as you're aware, they have recommended 3 finalists to present to the select board for final interviews, which was scheduled for today. So those interviews are scheduled beginning at 4 o'clock. We'll follow, if you wish, the same process that we use with the screening committee, where I'll initiate the questions, go through, you have the questions, it's submitted questions, and then you also ask for a scenario presentation, relative to finances. So I'll guide the candidates through that. I just want to leave it open that it is open, and the committee members from the screening committee can tell you if you have questions at any point, please feel free to interject. This is your interview. I'm here to facilitate and to work it through. So if something comes up, if you want to do a follow-up question at any point, feel free to ask the follow-up question. It's not waiting to the end. Sometimes that's more awkward, and especially if the question's pertaining to an answer they've just given. So feel free to interject, at any point. I'll go through the questions, and again, if you have additional questions you would like to ask at the end, that's fine. We set it up for an hour for each candidate. So the question's going to be, usually we stick to that hour so as not to, allow any, candidates extra additional time. They understand they need to get their answers in, somewhat, to the point as to the questions that are asked. So that'll be the process we'll use. Again, I'll sit off on the side. The candidate will be in front of you, and their job will be to direct their answers to the board. Again, you can feel free to ask questions as we proceed. I think that's the gist of it.
Will you be using these same questions we used in the original?
No, I sent out an additional list of questions for the board, more specific questions this time. So it's a little bit different format from the screening committee. So I did, send this out. We can make some copies if needed, for the board.
You have that, like, I did.
Okay, great. So it's these sheets there. If you want to add, this is the scenario question too, if you want to add that. So I think I'll add that.
Oh, sorry, just telling Randy, I think it was in an email.
Yeah,
That scenario was on the top, and it came from
Yeah.
Mike, I think.
Mike,
yeah, it was a while ago, though,
Yeah.
Randy. It was, basically I sent it out to everyone and asked for any additional suggestions.
okay,
That's where we got the scenario suggestion. We added that to the stack.
So the candidates only receive the scenario question. They don't have the other questions in advance. So that we don't send out, but I did send out the scenario piece, for them to have very specific. So at some point when we get to the finances, I'll ask them to make their presentation to you, the board, as if they were the sitting, town administrator. So I told them they need to bring in prepared documents, as we won't have, a PowerPoint of any sort to, be working off of. So if they are using a PowerPoint, they need to present the documents to the board. And I will sit with that, when they get.
April 17th.
it is.
So, the audience then will not be able to see any documents that we might be.
No, because we weren't sure whether we'd have the, in talking with Michael, we weren't sure we'd have the facility to be able to do that here.
Mhm.
So again, their idea is to present, they only have the 5 minutes, so it's not like it's going to be, 30 pages worth. I told them a couple of sheets, if they need to, to present, to follow with the board.
And John, maybe just for the public, I think this has come up in a couple of our meetings, but could you just characterize the number of applications we had, how many were interviewed?
Sure. So we did have 16 applications that were received for the position. The screening committee met and they had brought that down to 5 that they actually interviewed in the screening round. And so from that, 3 are being presented to the select board for consideration.
Maybe.
Sorry, I just did a dog pass off in the.
In the parking lot? Uh-oh, that's like a drug deal to me.
Okay, so Mike, would you like to sing some songs for us for 20 minutes?
I won't, I'm not a good singer.
Okay.
I totally.
Yeah.
How you been?
It's been busy.
Yeah, that time of year for you, right?
Yes, yes. I know, I felt bad. I missed the parade.
Well, we
But I
had a
thought it was
huge
good.
audience.
I bet it was nice out.
It's
We
beautiful.
got sunburnt though, working outside, but
And John, have you already checked references or?
Yes, so that's the document you received was based on reference checks.
Okay,
So.
so there's not, so everything that you need to do is basically done
Correct.
at this,
So we make sure we do that in advance.
yeah,
So that,
no
it's
surprise.
kind of, exactly, so it's kind of awkward when something pops up after the fact. So you have 3 candidates, been vetted. And, all 3 are active in municipal government today, and, all bring their skills to the table for you to review.
And then, in terms of the candidates, they understand what the hiring range is, what the
Yes.
benefits are.
Yeah.
I believe in the past, we ran into the circumstance where the again, everybody has a right to negotiate their contract, right?
Sure.
But I believe we did have one situation at one point where it seemed like there was a pretty good drift between what the candidate was expecting.
So in this case, I did bring to the board a candidate who did not follow through. And that, I believe, was a discussion, Mike, you brought that to the board and gave me direction. So we tried to do that as much upfront, and the posting was, I had the pay range, which you had approved. We had discussions on that, early on. And so basically, I had the understanding, of what the town, was seeking. And that was, described to candidates during the discussion, as needed. And again, we did have one candidate withdraw because of that discussion, but we brought that, when it was determined, the candidate, the range was not gonna fit the, candidate's expectations. We did ask whether there was, a room. I got an answer and that was passed on.
Yeah.
So.
I apologize, I'm asking you questions where the answer might be helpful to people.
Sure, I get that. Understand,
So I'm going, what would the viewing public?
fully understand. So just for the public, knowledge, I'm a retired town administrator. I was 40 years in municipal government, 35 pretty much as a town administrator. So worked with, several select boards. I retired out of Burlington, but I was also in a small town of Harvard, which is very similar, in demographics and somewhat with Hadley for 13 years. So, and I was there during the whole Devon's project, where the town had to, address that. So I was there in 88 to 01, during that whole piece where Devon's was closed and had to, the Devon's of today is, what's there now. So I was part of that whole planning stuff. So again, I had 40 years in municipal government, 35 as a town administrator. So my background is I have an understanding of the requirements of the position and, so on, so.
Great.
So would you remind me where you advertised this position?
So the advertisement was with the Mass Municipal Association. And also we send out, with our firm, we have the email of, all the town administrators and assistants in the state. This got sent out, basically to everybody. As well as the phone calls we made. So we do an active search. And so we, know people in this area. And, call and we speak to people, who do you think might be out there? So the administrators in this area all saw, the ad from us, saying, if you know somebody, please let us know. And that's how sometimes we get, recruits, for a position. So. And I also teach in the Suffolk program, the MMA Suffolk program. So I coordinate. And so I just had a class and we just finished a class 2 weeks ago in Pittsfield. So I had a bunch of, 25 administrator and department heads from Western Mass area. So got to meet, a lot of folks, through that. So we have a lot of connections. In that way, you get to meet a bunch of folks. So one class I had as guest speakers, Paul Bachman, the town manager, and Amherst and Lisa Long, the town administrator in South Hadley. So I asked them to be guest speakers, in one of our classes. So I had a good flavor of Western Mass, within that. So we get to see a lot of people between that and the principal of our firm, Bernie Lynch, is also involved in the program. So a bunch of the same people. Got to talk to Jen about Lisa here, and hired Lisa twice as town council, so over the years. I was on the MMA board with her 35 years ago. We served together on the MMA board.
You don't have to give
mayor.
dates if you don't want to.
I'm past that.
Lisa Mead might not want you to.
What's that?
Lisa Mead might not want you throwing out.
Oh, yeah, that's true. On the other side, yeah. I'll get a call from her tomorrow.
And Randy, I think.
Yeah, I see that.
Looks like he's.
David, can you hear us?
I can, yeah.
You can, okay, yes, we can hear you.
Where are you?
Yeah. Are you staying remote or are you coming in?
I'm gonna be late, but I'm trying to get in there. I'm on the way.
Okay, Appreciate it.
I remember last year, so really hot.
If the board is interested, these aren't set up as public hearings. You can start early if you'd like. The first candidate is here.
Oh, it's not set up as a public.
It's not a
not a
public hearing,
public
it's
hearing.
it's an interview.
Okay, but
I guess the
I-
question.
Yeah.
David is.
I will put a but in this.
Yeah.
People are expecting us to start at 4.
Okay.
So I don't think we should start until then. So we may get somebody that wants to,
Should we take a recess and turn the cameras off for 15 minutes?
that we can certainly do that, we might as well. So if somebody wants to. We need to make a motion to do that.
I'll make a motion that we take a brief recess to allow time for David to arrive and to make sure that the viewing public who wants to tune in at 4 o'clock. That's the whole shebang.
Is this live on YouTube?
I'll second that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our first candidate today is Nick Cackamo. He's before the board, and we're going to start with the first question.
Yeah,
So,
thanks, John.
First of all, thank you and congratulations on being one of the finalists here for the Hadley Town Administrator.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity.
So why don't you take a few minutes and tell us about your history and your specific interest in this position, and why do you think you would be successful here?
So when I left undergraduate, I went to the workforce thinking I might end up as a high school social studies teacher. And I worked at that for a few years, kind of off and on different positions. But during that time, I sought and was elected to the Pittsfield City Council. So I served on the Pittsfield City Council for 8 years. And I did so thinking, well, that's the opportunity for someone young, elder millennial coming out of college, sort of give back to the community and make a difference. And, you know, I think looking back at my own viewpoints, you know, the current administration and the transition to the Obama years was quite sort of inspiring to that process. So serving on the city council, it became really quick, really clear that a lot of what moves the needle in local government is that of the bureaucracy. It is the town planner, it is the treasurer, it is all those little pieces that no one really thinks about. And here I was thinking, oh, it's the elected body that really does everything. And that's not to say that that work isn't important and those oversights aren't really critical to a well-functioning local government operation. So in realizing that, towards the end of city council, I said, all right, I need to make a career change. And in doing so, I went back to the University of Massachusetts Amherst and pursued a dual degree in public policy and administration and regional planning. And to me, that was the next step in realizing sort of career change or the brand change from public education to public service. So in doing so, I completed those 2 master's degrees over the course of 2 to 3 years. And then in the spring of 2021, I was hired as the town administrator nearby in the town of Williamsburg, small community, about 2,500 people. So for 3 years, I faithfully showed up for work and learned everything I could about that job and realized that this is the field I want to be in. And I do want to continue moving forward. And what that looks like, I think, is larger town administration jobs similar to Hadley. The population might be 6,000 to 8,000. Ultimately, the ceiling being some form of town manager, being the ideal thing. So here I am today to offer, what I have as you have an opening posted.
So talk about why you would be successful here. Add that piece to the discussion.
Right. So I think what makes me a successful and interesting candidate is kind of the toolkit I bring. So I bring elected experience, I bring direct administrative experience, and that's all kind of founded in sort of concrete academic, foundations. And so taking all of that, I think it allows for me to be a problem solver that has a lot of lenses in the toolkit. So, depending on what we're looking at, what we have to address, I can kind of draw on those experiences to help chart those paths forward and work with the board to kind of fulfill their policy goals and their outlook for the community.
And just as a note, the board can interject follow-up questions at any point during the interview. How would you work with the board in understanding the vision of the board for the town? And what do you see as your role in that process, as well as setting a path for implementation?
Sure. I think in these administration jobs, we really defer to the board as the public policy leaders of the community. So I think at the onset, it's really understanding what are your goals, right? I don't come into these jobs thinking I have all the answers, or you should look to me to solve every single problem. But what I can do is help you move your vision forward in that community. So I think it really starts if the board offers a really clear, direct vision, whether that's guided through its comprehensive plan, personal goals, or just general community sentiment. It all becomes working on the same team and like moving the needle forward on this process. But to me, it feels like it needs to start with the board. And, having built those years of experience, I'm happy to be a part of those conversations, give an outside point of view. I don't live in Hadley, so I can at least draw on sort of other community experiences. And hopefully that helps you formulate those visions, clarify them, narrow the scopes, and then we can take those concrete steps to realize them over time.
The board is in consensus that leadership skills are critical in this hire. What skills and approach will you bring to the table to address this?
So leadership skills where I think were most developed over time for me were actually like the days I'd spent teaching. So teaching is this really interesting opportunity where you kind of have to be on all the time, whether you're sort of sick or not feeling it, or it's just a rainy day. But over time, you kind of have to like fill that role. And I think what I did for my students was I showed up every day. I showed interest and engagement in the things that sort of made them tick and kind of became sort of a partner in that process. So part of my leadership style is a bit of sort of the softer side of things, where I kind of take time to get to know a person, get to understand their sort of interests, what draws them to their work, and then just take an interest in what they do. Because I think if you move around through departments, whether that's the Council on Aging or the accountant, right, they're going to find and point out some intricacies that they really feel proud of, maybe where they have their fingerprint particularly on. And we want to emphasize that and build on those small victories and kind of encourage them to keep wanting to come to work, and then do an excellent job for the community.
Let's talk about this particular position here in Hadley. What, based on your understanding, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities for the position?
So the sense I get that one of the primary challenge facing Hadley over the next year, 2 or 3 is it looks like you're going to be needing to go to the voters for a levy override next year or the year after. Which if you read Daily Hampshire Gazette, you see that sort of recurring in multiple communities. So I think obviously the first challenge is really deciding, is that critically necessary to meet the general government and educational sort of needs of the community? And if so, how do you present that? And I think that's part of why that exercise we're maybe going to give candidates a chance to talk about that. I don't know how that'll fit in, but to me, that looks like one of the biggest challenges. And, every community is kind of facing that in different ways. We're feeling those external pressures from utility increases for heat and electricity in our buildings. Health insurance costs are skyrocketing. Employee compensation is catching up to a market that is kind of squeezing consumers at every point. So we have to balance all those things while still delivering a certain level of services that the community has come to expect. That to me feels like one of the biggest challenges. And I think what Hadley offers is sort of an interesting dynamic where you look at the Valley and to some extent the Berkshires, right? A lot of it is sort of a tourism-based economy where the Pioneer Valley sort of benefits from this really strong 5 colleges network. And so you have a sort of like excess revenue that's coming in from students, and Hadley represents, probably the largest commercial sector of any of the towns. That to me seems like a big opportunity just to kind of maintain and cultivate that, understand like that relationship in terms of land use and what makes sense for the community. You have a pretty modest single tax rate. I find that kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure, someone who came from Pittsfield who does have a pretty high split tax rate. Our commercial sector exists and not all that dissimilar. We have really big pockets of kind of commercial strip mall development, not too unlike the Route 9 corridor. Be curious if the town's explored split tax rates, what that does for revenue generation, is there a sort of tension between large box stores and those smaller independent businesses that exist in the same corridor?
You're in the neighborhood now.
Mhm.
What do you see as the opportunity here in Hadley? Why the move? You've talked about career move.
Yep.
But what excites you about Hadley here?
I mean, I think government is this interesting opportunity where scalability is sort of the X factor in these things. So Hadley's operating budget's about twice that of Williamsburg. The population's about 2.5 times Williamsburg. So all those things in totality make it a more potentially more interesting place because it's a little more dynamic. There's more going on. You kind of have to wear more hats and you have to kind of get a better sense of those. And I think that I'm well suited to make that transition, and I'm going to seek opportunities until I find them.
From your experience and observation, what's the single most important characteristic of an effective town administrator?
So I think one of the most effective characteristics of a town administrator personally is its consistency. So when I was hired in Williamsburg, I had a lot of the same levels of experience, elected education, academic education, so forth. But I lacked that direct sort of administrative experience. I didn't quite know what the day-to-day would shake out to be. But even in that, it felt like if I showed up every day and put my best foot forward and made those attempts to kind of fill the exiting town administrator's role, that was the most that to me, I think, was the most helpful in finding my place and understanding that. So coming into new town administration positions, I think I have that foundational work that I didn't have, 4 years ago. And that becomes really applicable to like real operating, on the government side. I have a really good sense of what goes on in these offices, what kind of softwares everyone's using, what are the rhythms and patterns. It takes time to like learn them and memorize them. But once you do, you kind of get the real good sense of that. And I don't think that occurs if I get deterred early on in that process and say, well, maybe this wasn't right for me. I've stuck through it. I've showed up. I've commuted a long way. I put my best foot forward at every turn, and I try to be responsive to all the things. I think when administrators walk in the morning, there's 40 plus unread emails, and no matter how many times I write the to-do list on my drive to work, it almost never gets done because we have to be responsive to every little new hiccup that didn't occur. But we try to do that, and we try to put our best foot forward and, kind of meet the community's needs.
Right. I think the chief's looking to get rid of that to-do list.
Sure, I was just chuckling because we were just talking about that today.
The hiccup part?
Oh, the part that the to-do list never gets done because there's always so many fires to put out by the time you get to work in the morning.
Yeah.
So the town takes a lot of pride in the school district here.
Yeah.
And it is a local school district.
Great.
What's a proper relationship look like between general government of the town and schools?
Proper relationship. I mean, it needs to exist, and it needs to be like sort of reverse open door policies on those things. I mean, when you look at our operating budgets, near 50+% is educational costs, and those aren't nothing when you look at sort of general government side of things, where small changes in hours or positions on paper might only be tens, $20,000, $30,000. Sometimes those increases are a little more observed, if you will, whereas school increases might be in the 50, 100 plus thousands of dollar increases. And sometimes they're just sort of taken at face value, and rightfully so. Educating children isn't the place where you need to cut dollars from. But I think it comes from understanding sort of, well, what are the goals of the Hadley public school systems? how can local governments support those things? And how do we balance sort of the fiscal constraints that we deal with every single year? I would hope that, I feel like my relationship with the principal at the local school and for what it's worth, the Hampshire Regional School District has had like a total redo of all of their administrative staff. So we try to maintain open doors. We pick up those calls. We respond to those emails in a timely manner. And we see like how the two parts can sort of work in synergy together. And at the end of the day, we're all sort of committed to the same goals of, quality of life improvements in the community.
You talked about times maybe getting a little difficult, financially, and when that happens, usually innovation and, creative problem solving, is a step to go. So what do you think are the latest trends in municipal management, that might be able to help? What do you see as a couple of these trends that interest you?
So I think if you're looking at some smaller communities, shared services agreements seems to be kind of the first method that people are turning to, where sort of communities can share the cost of a position over 5 towns. So on paper, that looks really good. Sometimes in practicality, it becomes hard to sort of manage, like, what's your direct return on investments? Or are you oversupplying, the salary of this person, but in other smaller communities, getting more services? So that becomes like an oversight question. But generally, that's one of the best solutions for small towns, is to approach these shared services agreements. Again, similarly, the state through grant programs might fund those for 1 year. And then you sort of have to like use that as the trial year, feel like, is this good for the community? Do we want to continue it in like year 3, 4, et cetera? That feels like one of the trends. And I think you're also going to be, if you're thinking in the context of fiscal constraints, and you're having to determine questions of like what positions to fill, you then kind of have to fall back on asking current employees to do more with potentially less resources and the same amount of time. So those are going to have some trade-offs in terms of increased compensation, being really particular about what the output of those positions are and how they sort of further the goals of the board. But I mean, in terms of trends, I think we're in a field that when you post a job, it's not often you have just hundreds of applicants to choose from. So I think a lot of times we have to sort of cultivate talent from within. That might mean taking a chance on a person who doesn't have quite the full skill set, but could learn that over time. And if they are willing to take that chance, I think it's beholden on the board and the administrators sort of build on their successes, sort of increase their self-esteem in that process, and hopefully sort of get them to those tiers that we're looking for. And, sometimes looking internally to fill these positions can be really effective.
Talk about some of the things that you've been able to do, in your time in Williamsburg as to, some innovation or some changes you've been able to initiate.
Yeah, so when I started in the town of Williamsburg, we had shared accounting services through the FERCog. So we had a shared accountant. She would come once a week, and she was also serving 4 other communities. She was delightful. I really liked working with her, and she was really good at what she did. But ultimately, she took another job outside of the FERCog, and it left the town sort of with this accounting gap to fill. And at the time, we approached the then treasurer, who was a part-time, and sort of posed the question. I said, could you take over accounting? Would that be of interest to you? And he thought about it, and he did have some background in accounting. And granted, municipal and private accounting are a bit different, but he was up to the challenge. Subsequently, we had just hired a new tax collector who did have some experience as a treasurer as well. So what we presented to the board was the treasurer became the accountant part-time. The collector became a collector treasurer full-time. She had an assistant. That worked out really well. I don't like any change. Those first years can be the first year can be particularly difficult, especially managing all of the deadlines that come from Department of Labor Services. Sorry. And in doing so, getting to that first year, the town is better well-positioned, having stronger oversight of its internal financial controls. And I think the town is for a modest investment, has employees that are really committed to those roles and is going to keep them in a strong position going forward. And this has like spillover effects into, setting the tax rate, certifying your free cash, getting your audit done, all those sort of quirky financial aspects that we have to account for. So I feel like that's one thing where, identifying what the town had in terms of internal resources and just posing the question. And then in doing so, kind of trying to encourage and, be supportive of that. So, for all the hiccups, there are these small victories that occurred and we need to celebrate those and make sure that, people are recognized for their good work that they do.
Okay, let's kick into some finance discussion. So talk about your role in financial planning, as well as your financial management strategies for ensuring organizational sustainability. So specifically, talk about your role in preparation of the town budget, operating capital, enterprise funds, and so on.
Yeah, so the enterprise funds are really kind of strictly handled by the Water Sewer Commission there. I mean, their operating is just under $500,000 and it's sustained primarily by like a full-time superintendent and then like periodic part-time person. So I don't have like a real big hand in water sewer operations, although it's a pretty interesting facet of local government. But in terms of FY or fiscal year, like budget creation, it starts with our office. And we compile and track those, and we attend every single finance committee meeting. So they've been meeting bi-weekly since February. We're right there alongside with them. We're doing those 2.5 calculations. We're looking at our reserves. We're taking in all those requests from the departments. We're comparing them. We're also hosting department heads for individual budget meetings, which, is not like an unknown practice. But it's so interesting that year over year, with the new persons that do come onto the finance committee, how many times they say, oh, I didn't realize that your department did those things. And I think department heads leave, feeling, really interested in sharing those experiences, sharing all the little things that go into, what accounts for pretty shoestring operation in these small towns. But I think it helps the finance committee, particularly who is elected, understand what operational government looks like. And I'm right there to try to answer all of their questions. And I do think I have a really strong depth of financial understanding. So, looking at these budgets, again, I think it's more of a scalability thing. The services aren't all that different, whether it's a $200 million Pittsfield budget or a $22 million Hadley budget. A lot of those parts are similar. It's just the size and scope of them might be a bit smaller. So I feel like I have a really strong handle on that. Been doing financial oversight since my time on the city council. This is not new to me. But in terms of sort of fiscal management, I think at some point you can only cut expenses so long. And, I'm not like 100% clear on your HR practices, but this is where like it's so critically important to be setting up sort of step structures and pay ranges. Employees are really like desperate to know sometimes, like, what am I allowed to make or like possibly going to make, whether that's just contingent on cost of living adjustments and all those things. But like, it feels so critical to be able to go and say like, all right, we know your position's classified at this, you can really max out at this rate. And then kind of adjust those, every few years to meet sort of like market trends and cost of living adjustments and things like that. So I do feel like budgeting is one of the strongest things I do. And I think if you look at my little sheet, you'll see that like data presentation is kind of an interesting thing that I like to spend a little bit of time on. I think that's really critically important to say, here's all the information. And granted, this is a quick snapshot and but I think it's important when you look at sort of presenting data, especially numbers that range into the millions, like it has to be digestible to the public. And I'm also someone who really feels like a level of high transparency. So we just published the warrant for town meeting in Williamsburg, and it contains all 147 lines of our bi-weekly accounting report. So everyone in the public is going to know very clearly what it is and what we're funding. And if they have a question, I'll be the one that can answer that for them.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Nick, you had mentioned at the start of your answer, talking about Williamsburg with water sewer operations. Mm-hmm. do you have a treatment facility where they do treat water there or?
So wastewater in Williamsburg, it only exists largely on the Route 9 corridor and some of the ancillary things, but it all goes to Northampton's treatment center. So
So budgeting purposes, do you handle the enterprise budget when it comes to that? Do you play a role in that or is it?
we were part of those like contract discussions on like how much like whatever the measurement of wastewater, what's it, gallons per something, sorry.
But as far as the
Yeah.
enterprise budget itself goes,
Mhm.
Northampton handles that part of it.
Well, it's contracted, so the commission knows what they have to appropriate each year. And then other than that, it's just check-ins at the sort of the check stations, and those are paid by appointment. There's sort of a water sewer foreman, and he sort of oversees the wastewater side of things. Williamsburg has 2 drinking facilities, but much of the town is on well and septic as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so your DPW director or your public works director, whatever his title is, if there's a major repair that needs to happen, some infrastructure damage.
Largely-
things like that.
Largely is at least like front loaded by the highway department.
Yeah.
So the foreman of the highway is also the superintendent of water sewer, and the highway superintendent is the highway superintendent, but he's also part of the water sewer system. So it's a lot of like wearing multiple hats, which is
Yeah.
not uncommon in the community. And the system itself isn't like massive, and it's fairly new. So like
Okay,
the needs aren't enormous, but they keep it good. And like they'll involve me when they need to, contracting wise and like procurement and things like that.
thanks.
During your answer on finances, you said "we" a lot. Define "we." What's your team look like, from the finance side?
Well, my office is myself full-time and an 18-hour administrative assistant to the Board of Selectmen. So the "we" is sort of the proverbial like her and I and those things. But I use "we" all the time because I don't think government has, like, there's not a lot of individuality in local government. And I think, using those "we" opposed to "I" like feels like the right diction when like communicating those things, because it's at the end of the day, I think it's as a sort of ancillary, but when you tell people what you do for work, you're like, oh, you're town administrator. What is that? I'm like, oh, well, it's this kind of interesting role where I'm involved with just about everything, but I don't have like pure decision-making authority a lot of times. And there's a lot of deference to the boards and like the department heads and those things. But that's okay.
What's your experience with financial
Did
forecast? I'm sorry.
Jane had a question, maybe.
Go ahead, Jane.
So is your finance committee, do the collector, treasurer and accountant also help you on that?
I check in with them, but I have a really strong handle on those things. So we're like aware of our constraints on 2.5. Really, like, I do my best to check in with all of these persons on a pretty regular basis. And I don't think there's a need to ask them to attend more night meetings in those processes. If there were, they would. But I think we work well enough sort of in the working hours, and I can communicate that to the after hour meetings.
So you're saying it's just you, yourself, your assistant and the finance committee that are preparing the budget?
Primarily, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it starts and stops like with me. So the finance committee historically meets bi-weekly, in early February, right through the end of May. On the off weeks, we're meeting with the board. So we're constantly sort of checking. I mean, it's going to be their warrant to sign. And occasionally there are like different points of view. So whether that's like, department structures or salary raises or expenses, like they may just have different points from the finance committee. And, it's beholden on me to sort of like be that conduit between those two committees and, put together a document that's digestible to the community and, meets the needs.
Do your boards have joint meetings?
Occasionally, we did more last year. Still working to figure out like what's the Goldilocks approach to that. So we did a lot of joint meetings, and I think at some point to me it kind of like slowed the process. So we did less joint meetings, but it feels like we need 1 or 2 more joint meetings to kind of like bridge those points of view sometimes. But again, we're still kind of looking for that Goldilocks zone. But prior to that, I don't think I can't speak for like the years I wasn't there, like how and the the committee, the finance committee in particular, has more turnover. It's 9 members, it's elected, 1, 2, and 3-year terms, so it does change a little bit.
What's your experience with financial forecasting and reviewing financial policies?
So I mean, I think there's kind of best practices I like to stick to, ensuring that your reserves are equal to or greater 10% of operating, whether that's your general stabilization and your free cash like combinations. The town itself doesn't have a lot of really delineated financial policies that we work with, but that said, we have strong internal like checks and balances, and we make sure that we're doing things that are correct. We're not overspending. We're not putting forward more money. The town historically has strong sort of free cash reserves at the end of the year, and typically sort of we put forward conservative estimates of local receipts when we're doing the tax rate recap, and those typically have come in a little bit higher. So that's afforded the town quite a bit of sort of deference in terms of, if you look at our warrant, there's a significant number of free cash purchases for like capital needs. So the town historically hasn't had to do much in the way of short-term borrowing or debt exclusion outside of some very large items. So the school renovation and the construction of a new public safety complex. But other than that, a lot of it's, funded directly on free cash. We're not paying interest on those things, and departments are maintaining their fleets to a very high level, and they're able to sort of like put that back into the community in terms of like a delivery of services.
So for the public understanding, the board asked me to put together a hypothetical situation. I just want to point out this is hypothetical, as to the situation. But I'm asking the candidates to assume that they are the current town administrator and that the powers to be have determined that a levy limit override is necessary. The levy limit override will be needed to balance the budget to maintain current service levels for schools and general government. So the candidates have been asked to make a presentation as to the options for the town to proceed with an $800,000 levy limit override. And again, I just snatched the number, from the air here. And a recommendation for a plan for the town to present and communicate this request to the citizens. This is not about actual cuts to be made, but the process you would do to recommend providing a list of cuts. So that's what's been given to the candidates. Board, you have a copy from Nick, on his presentation that you can follow along with. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Nick to address that scenario.
Yeah, sure. If you take a look at this document, it's pretty surface level, but I think it gets a point across of like how I would approach this concept. So if we're looking towards the possibility of needing an $800,000 override, putting that towards an election, and I think the last thing the community would want to do is sort of call that election and have it fail. So if we get to the point where you're needing it, I think one of the first steps you ought to do is approach sort of a community survey. And I just sort of listed a few questions on the Likert scale and some like quick demographics that, if you were to move a survey like this forward, basically kind of gauging the community satisfaction with government operations, both school and non-school, it would give you, I think, at least a temperature, a pulse of the community if they're willing to accept those overrides. And, I think every town I've ever worked in, I've often heard that like pressure of the tax rate and how people feel about the amount of taxes they pay. And those conversations are a wide range, but doing a survey like this with some demographic questions, whether that's age, sex, gender, students in the Hadley Public Schools or not, it allows you to create some sort of cross comparison. So maybe older adults are feeling like government services aren't satisfactory. Maybe sort of parents or guardians are feeling like, well, the schools are really great and we really love them. But, so if you issue this community survey, and it can certainly be expanded, these are sort of general questions, but we want to use sort of Likert scales where we can sort of parse out sort of outliers and see where like people fall on those range of satisfactions particularly. I think the second piece too is after you've conducted this, sort of community survey for the possibility, without even saying the words override, but, just again, gauging the financial sort of pulse and temperature of the community. You might then want to be moving into sort of a larger scale budget forum. So I don't know if Hadley's hosting these, but this to me feels like an opportunity where you could take all of the lines of your budget and you can kind of prepare them. So I like to defer to sort of these tree map diagrams to give people sort of that spatial sense of spending, what does that look like? So, we just kind of articulated those things. We want to be really clear of like the town's financial footprint in getting to that override question. And this goes back to that idea of like presenting a lot of really sort of dense data to the community in a way that's sort of palatable and digestible. So taking time to really like work with the financial team to say like, okay, we know these are the important numbers, but how do we make that feel sort of real and tangible to the general community that may not have a lot of time to understand or learn these things or even care that much, but you want to go through that effort. And I think hosting those, kind of public forums allow the community an opportunity to ask maybe those questions they didn't know, like, what does, the assistant tax collector do? And then they can kind of get a sense of those things and they can directly feel how government is serving the community at large. Then subsequently, within that sort of budget, what is important to me is like, there's the importance of digestible, like quantitative data, like all the things that make a budget exist, just purely numbers. And I know everyone's not a math person, so we don't need to sort of deliver a huge amount of statistical analysis, but we need to provide something that gives you a fair, like, understanding or framework for those things. And then sort of the next phase in this process is kind of presenting to the public, there's our levy limit budget, which would result in layoffs or sort of changes to government operation. So we can do that numerically, breaking out into categories and sort of like smaller pieces. And, I think the follow-up to that is you've got to include that sort of the story behind those layoffs. So, what does it mean when you lay off an art teacher? What does it mean if you reduce the hours of your procurement officer? And that is beholden on sort of the administrator and the board and government officials to kind of tell that story in a way that makes it more relatable to the general public. And the same goes for approaching the levy override budget. So this is a tough question that any board would have to ask their community. Basically, we need more money from the tax levy. Well, okay, that's fine. But if you don't tell a story that connects to the public and sort of shows what you're delivering, I think you go into that election worried that you might lose. So to me, it's like, if you're going to take that question of an override to the voters, it starts with sort of understanding the temperature and pulse through sort of survey data, being able to sort of distill complex and oftentimes very dense financial information to something that's palatable and digestible, and then be able to tell those stories in a way that feels relatable to the general public, and ultimately kind of seeking that override one way or another.
Is that something you've had to do in the past?
Williamsburg has not needed an override.
Any other questions?
Yeah, could I ask just, and I apologize if I missed it, so
Sure.
collective bargaining, dealing with town council, legal issues.
Yep.
You had, Williamsburg have any unions or?
Does not have any non-school unions. So the school committee handles the contract negotiations with the school union over there. So on the town side, we have extended contracts to the 5 full-time department heads. So I have worked closely with legal counsel in that process through executive discussion and, sort of in that part, but we don't have collective bargaining in the sense of like, maybe an administrator's union or something like that.
And also, just in terms of, you were talking before about needing to get creative, obviously limited resources to go around.
Sure.
You were talking about, exploring shared positions. Obviously, you have a relationship with the FERPA that you had mentioned.
Yep.
What about the legislative delegation, grant writing, one stop? All those wonderful things.
Yeah. So no, I have like a keen experience in all of those things. And I think what becomes really critical is, you can apply for any number of grants under the sun. They just need to make sense in the context of those things. So Williamsburg has exceedingly strong volunteer base that will often write these very like comprehensive, multi-million-dollar grants. So I have such like a familiarity with that, but it works so well because they're like community members that are really committed to furthering the quality of life, and they understand sort of the limited operations of those things. But over time, I've sort of built those needs, right? Like, so grant writers, rightfully so, deserve all the sort of accolades for doing those things, doing the paperwork, like producing these really beautiful documents, really deep information. Well, then you get awarded that grant. So now you've got to administer it. And that's where sort of the town administrator's office kind of comes into play. And we keep all those things behind the scenes. We're filling those quarterly reports. We're making sure invoices are paid correctly and timely. And we do all those things that keep those grants flowing. And then ultimately you get to the point where, you have these deliverables and, they're celebrated, rightfully so, and then closing them out. So I have all of the pieces of that. It just, to me, it feels like the board really needs to take the direction on those. So using the one-stop program can be a really effective tool, but what do you want to get out of the one-stop program? And if you know what you want to get, you can look at those applications. You can then sort of dig deeper into your community resources, kind of fill in those pieces over time.
In HR today, what are some of the key issues do you feel that need to be addressed?
I think continually we hear the need for sort of market compensation for employees. I think there's always that tension that they might seek employment in the private sector that could pay higher. So I think communities have a few options to sort of cut that down a little bit. And I think that part of it starts with sort of classification scales and salary ranges can be a really effective tool for persons, especially when they're coming on board, getting a sense of like what their long-term earnings might be in a position like that. Subsequently, supporting professional development, building on sort of the little pieces that they find interesting about that job. So sort of make it more, like they want to keep coming and doing that work. And then additionally, I think towns can be a little creative and sort of items outside of compensation. I think the easy one is sort of vacation packages. So it's not uncommon for a community to offer sort of 10 PTO days for the first 5 years of employment. So that's like quite limiting. But I think if you take, just the modest step of offering 1 day addition after year one, just kind of building on that, 10+1, 10+2, et cetera, until you get to that 5-year mark. I think those are helpful in sort of employee retention rates. So, working in the public sector has its benefits. And, I think there's just some little non-monetary tweaks to personnel policies that towns can sort of pursue that help sort of just cultivate or like create higher employee satisfaction, and then hopefully sort of longevity in those positions.
When you're hiring, what are 3 important qualities you seek in a potential employee?
So right off the bat for me, it's like a curiosity, so I've kind of noted that, I think municipal hiring has limitations in terms of the depth of pool of candidates. And, I'm not afraid to, take a chance on a person who does seem curious and interested in those positions. And if they're showing an interest and willingness to learn, I think that it's one of those things where if you make those right choices, it's a little high risk, but the reward can be quite high, especially if they come to really enjoy that work and, feel supported and, like come into that position. So curiosity is the big one. I think also sort of like the public sector as, I almost want to say like, they have to appreciate the humor of Parks and Rec in some ways. And it's like it is just a different feel than you've worked in before. And I think that show often comes off as a documentary to people like us who are part of that. But yeah, again, realizing the difference and sort of embracing the difference between the public sector and the private sector. And then thirdly, I think it's just like a willingness to be creative and adaptive. I mean, we're constantly being asked to do things that are well outside of our job description, and we'll never be able to capture every single moment of those things. But, when I graduated, from UMass, I didn't think I'd be, necessarily like doing as much building maintenance as I'm doing directly, or sort of as much IT support as I'm doing. But like at the end of the day, we have limited resources, so we do the best to move the collective forward. And I think that comes up the mindset.
You addressed some pieces of encouraging teamwork earlier in your discussion, but how do you deal with a subordinate who's not a team player?
I would say I don't think two examples are ever going to be the same. So I'm never gonna, without understanding why they're feeling like it starts with kind of understanding their position. Why are they choosing to engage in that way? And I think that takes all sort of shapes and sizes. So I'm not going to try to like put everything into one neat little box, but it starts with sort of understanding their points of view and maybe potentially trying to take like small steps forward to improve that like sort of workspace dynamic and sort of move away from sort of the I closer to the we, and see if we can't sort of bridge that gap. But, I'm not going to be able to give you like these real pristine examples until you get presented with that situation. And again, I think that's part of like, that's the job we do, right? If someone wakes up on a Monday and says, well, I hate everything, I'm taking everything down with me. Well, if that wasn't accounted for on Friday, we've got to make some real adjustments going into Monday.
You started in Pittsfield, you were in Williamsburg, and now potentially you're looking to come to Hadley. Coming in tonight, I had to pass through the gauntlet, on Route 9, come across. I think I saw half your offices, working details. But, talk about economic development. What would be your approach, with this town that has due personality, when it comes to that?
Yeah, so obviously Hadley has a pretty large stretch of what I assume is developable commercial parcels along the Route 9 corridor. And I think economic development really starts with how strong your zoning is. So if the board feels that their zoning really represents their vision and is the framework for the community, then we need to lean on that. And if you don't think that's the case, then you need to invest the time into creating a zoning ordinance that you think reflects community values. And, that's arguably the single most important legislation of any locality. So taking the time and investing that time into sort of creating something that you feel is representative of the community and its goals and its visions will have those sort of long-term dividends in sort of terms of what kind of economic development you see. I'm not going to sit here and advocate that you need, more box stores and a sea of parking. I don't think that's sustainable, interesting development. But, through community conversation, obviously your comprehensive plan is quite a few years old at this point. You had a redo in 2017. So, chances are your demographics have changed considerably. Community sort of vision and priorities have changed, and that's got to catch up to what, and also be like sort of how you move economic development forward and creating sort of a model that isn't just beholden on, parking in a store, right? And like what makes sense for a community. And and I would say, depending, and then, there are some like sort of financial sort of incentives you can put forward if you find the right type of development that you want to see. Particularly like tax incremental financing can be an interesting tool to sort of attract and, make a developer see a project as more like profitable in a community like this. And then it's, and again, you're so close to the University of Massachusetts, there's probably some synergies that I'm not fully aware of. I did go there, I did drive through the town, but I'm sure I'm missing some nuances that I don't quite see on a daily basis.
Communication is ever changing. Talk about your strategies relative to communication internally, externally, and how do you get the citizens to understand where the path of the town?
So internally, I have a wide open door policy. I think it's pretty rare you would come by town offices to see my door closed, outside of sort of a legal meeting. But, I think that's part of the job, right? Like you have to be available to the public. And I don't guarantee that the public shows up every day with kind of the best foot forward. Sometimes people come in with, very hot temperatures and, it's beholden on us to sort of try to temper the situation in some ways, hear them out, kind of understand where those frustrations are coming with. And then kind of explain to them back, these are the opportunities for solutions. These are the resources we have. And I think that comes with, over the years, right? I can't tell you the number of emails I've responded to, as a city councilor, and pretty rare that they were generally positive, right? People are reaching out because they're mad or frustrated or feel like they're sort of not being heard in some capacity. So it's really beholden on us to take the time to work through those and, kind of not just reply in the singular, give some depth, give some resources, make those connections for those things. And obviously, I think communication level can vary. It depends on like what you're looking for, what you're trying to get across. I would say that I would commit more time and resources. And I wish I had more time on my side to just like use the website as the critical landing pad. So if anyone has a question about the community of Hadley, their first stop should be the town website. And then, over time, like using those, typically I think everyone's using some version of like Civic Plus or, what, but like the interface is not super complicated, but you do need to take the time to like figure out how to post things. And to me, government transparency is so critical. We should just be flooding these websites with as much information as you have and can like sustainably like communicate to those just so people are aware. And then I think over time, people can start to see that as the landing page, making those news, kind of being like the forefront, like, oh, what's going on? Or I forgot what was happening this time, like using the website primarily as like the primary landing pad for the community.
So how do you resolve conflicts or a dispute? It's part of what, an administrator does. So talk about that and maybe give an example.
So solving conflict and disputes, I think, starts with understanding a person's position versus their interests. And I think sometimes if their position is steadfast and unmoving, it's going to be kind of difficult to get to yes. But when they take a minute to sort of articulate their interests as to why that's their position, you can kind of help move those needles. So, we're a small town. And if you've been to our town offices, it's old and haunted. And there are some major spatial limitations to our building. So we tried to be aware of that. And I'll admit, like, I haven't been able to solve all of those spatial limitation problems. And, that's no fault of trying, but it does require some buy-in occasionally. So, if the board feels like, it's just needs to be supportive of those things as well. And I think that comes with, I try to be an administrator who you ought not to be surprised by anything. So I try to create like a pretty extensive public record and share with you like all the information I'm getting in sometimes a very dense folder of materials, but we want to bring you along for those decision-making things. I mean, ultimately you are the chief policy makers of the community. And I think it kind of starts with that umbrella and, covers the town's operations. But, to me, it's, again, these are singular instances. I don't know that I have any like silver dagger solutions other than to say interests and positions are pretty critical in understanding like the inputs of those situations and then being creative with what possible solutions are. And I know that seems like a really broad, unspecific answer, but I think it's at least the context and how I would frame all of these things. And I don't know that I can give you just one example where I solved this very interpersonal, very specific situation with Starburst jelly beans or something.
We're less than 10 minutes at this point on the clock, so I just want to make sure, see if the board has any additional questions. I can, finish up with board relationships here. But I just, in case there's questions from the board.
So you have noticed driving through our town that we have a huge Route 9 presence. So we see ourselves as a residential town,
Okay.
very small, and in the daytime, we're 100,000 people.
Sure.
And that's a hard thing to do when you're on a small town budget. And people all think that our commercial base pays a whole lot of taxes. They're about 30% of our tax rate. Is that reasonable?
I think that's what was in the
Yeah,
Mhm.
so, it's the residents who are really happy with their low tax rate.
Right.
But the town is really two different entities.
Mhm.
It's the nice, quiet residential community, and then it's the bustling thing, and that's a hard thing for a lot of people to comprehend.
Yeah.
So do you have any sense of? I'm not asking a specific question, so it's hard to answer that, I guess.
Sure. All I would say is that I think two things can be true at the same time. And as an outsider to Hadley, driving the Route 9 corridor or sneaking through back roads to campus, right? Like they are different places. And I think that's some of the nuance that I can confront and tell you, I don't really fully understand the closest equivalency. Pittsfield itself, has the largest hospital in Berkshire County. It has, it's the county seat for court system. So in a similar, but not the same way, it does draw in a lot of that outside public. And if you were talking to the police chief, they would say, well, on the weekends, we police a very different subset of the community. And we just have more people during the day, and that has impacts on traffic and just other standard delivery of services. But I think that's something like really understanding that relationship would come with time. And I don't think there's any other way to realize that.
Talk about the overall relationship an administrator has with the board, and what's a successful relationship look like?
I think a successful relationship, that's one of the questions I always ask in these interviews is how the board views that relationship with their administrator. And I think you can see a lot of variance in that. So I don't know if this is a very hands-on board. I don't know if this is a very hands-off board or somewhere in the middle. So I think using the onset of that relationship to build a strong foundation and doing, check-ins, how are we feeling about this? How are we feeling about this dynamic? What can we be doing better? Again, one of the other questions I typically ask in these situations is how does the board deliver feedback to the administrator, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent? Is that something you're doing on a regular basis? Like, how are we getting a sense that we're meeting your expectations, and are you telling us those expectations? Are we on the same page with everything?
And how would you accept that? You want our feelings about what's happening. Are you okay with, well, we got a real problem with this, and are you good at accepting that and being able to talk about it and try to get it figured out?
I believe so. Yeah, I do. But I think it's would be situational.
Mhm.
And, personally, it's like if some expectation isn't communicated to me, I'm going to feel one way. But if we can set up sort of benchmarks and deliverables and, we kind of check in on those, that's a whole different situation.
So you've been in Williamsburg for just about 4 years, right?
Right. Yep.
And you mentioned that you see yourself eventually as a town manager somewhere.
Somewhere.
So in your mind, what's the path forward to that point?
Let's continue experience in the field. And I think it starts with sort of these tiered communities, right? And what I'm finding also in these interviews is perhaps I'm interviewing better with some boards and not other boards. And I can't quite, I'm the same person and the resume is the same, but dynamics are going to be different board to board. But like getting to sort of a manager position is going to require sort of consistency and commitment to the field. So albeit, not a day over 40, but I've only got 4 years in the administrative field, but it doesn't take away from someone who's deeply knowledgeable about local government insofar as exceeding most people's understanding of what it means to be a local government.
So if I may, David, I've had something in mind that I think you're trying to ask him.
Yeah.
Are we a stepping stone to the next level?
I don't know that. Again, I think two things can be true at the same time. I can be young and willing to want to further my career, but still show up every day and do a good job. And I don't know what's gonna each day holds, right? I'm an avid road runner. My propensity for getting hit by a car is quite a bit higher than most people. So if I don't show up on Monday, it's not because I didn't want to come to work, right? So I don't know that I can give you a real answer other than say two things can be true at the same time.
I understand your answer, and I think that my concern would be that you would come into this job knowing full well that I'm gonna stay here for 2 or 3 years or whatever until I learn some more, and then I'm gonna look elsewhere. And I know you can't give me a yes or no, but
I didn't imply thinking that. And I don't make any assumptions on the next day, but
John, what's the average time frame that town administrators usually stay in the job? Is it
Yeah.
14-year person like?
You know, these days we kind of say 5 to 7, you know, and it depends where, it depends on the level of the position. And it depends on the interaction between the board and the manager, you know, these days, you know, so it can be as short as, you know, 1 year. But typically, you know, we're looking at, 5 to 7 is kind of what we see as an average. I always suggest to the board, you can't really look past 5 years, you know, and the other thing I'll say to the board is if you've got someone who's performing at a very high level for that 5 years, would you prefer to have that than someone who comes in at a more mediocre level who stays for 10? You know, and so
There's only
that's.
one right answer to that question.
And, you know, so those are the dynamics of the discussion.
Yeah.
You know, and so we always say in our profession, given a minimum of 2. Is what our code says, that, when you sign up with the mass managers and international city managers, you say minimum of 2. But basically, it's thought of as 5, is more realistic.
So one thing I actually did want to make a comment that I do appreciate though, is because we currently have a committee looking at form of government and, that you're wanting to end up at more of a town manager versus a town administrator that, when that committee comes back to us, I mean, that could end up being, a finding. So
Sure.
you're like you would, you don't want to just be a town administrator, you would be okay for having additional authority.
I'm not scared of
potentially.
those additional responsibilities.
So we are at the artificial time,
Mhm.
and it is artificial if you wish to continue, but we are at the ending point here. So, yeah.
One question. If you're successful in your bid, so to speak, what sort of condition would you be leaving the town of Williamsburg? What do you think people would be saying when you walk out the door?
I think you wouldn't leave anything half baked. So when I came on board, there was a little bit of like, here you go, figure it out. Okay, it's
What
fine.
makes you think this is gonna be any different?
Now I know what I'm getting into. Right? I've demonstrated consistency and transparency. And, where I have had deference, maybe everyone's not agreed with decision-making or choices, but I feel good with those things. Ethical, I show up to work, I'm committed to sort of the greater government cause. And I think that has noticeable impacts. And I try to put my best foot forward. And, we're in the midst of a decent renovation project. And, I like to see that through its fruition, finally plant the flower bed, hopefully. It's critical. Yeah, we're so close. But yeah, no, I would try to make that transition as seamless as possible.
At least you know where to locate the interim town administrator here.
Oh,
In between.
okay, yeah, sure.
All right, with that, unless the board has additional.
Anybody else?
So this is an opportunity, Nick, for a final closing statement to the board.
Yeah, so. Yeah, you caught me off guard with this again, but did it at the screening hearing. So as I kind of mentioned, one of my hobbies is endurance sports, particularly like road running and backpacking. And I keep this spreadsheet just on my laptop, and it tracks my daily mileage, and we put in those inputs, average heart rate, distance, workout, etc. And it's a spreadsheet that has 366 rows. And I update it daily. And then I include some sort of ancillary things. And where I think that demonstrates an importance is the commitment to consistency. So you get better at running by doing more of it, just putting more miles under your feet. And I think that same thing holds true for these administrator positions. You know, I don't proclaim to have every answer, nor do I proclaim to have done everything 100% correct. But I show up every day and I try to do my best and make improvements. You know, I'm reflective in what went well, and I try to be just as reflective in, you know, maybe what didn't go as well. And I think I learned a lot, and I would obviously make some adjustments to any new position I find myself in, wherever that might be. But I think it's correlates, you know, to the same commitment and consistency I give to my own sort of personal endurance hobbies. So that happens in the workplace too. And I think that over time, the consistency pays off, and, you know, of course, of like better PRs, you know, better overall marathon times, and just better government operations.
Any other closing comments from the board? Okay, so that concludes this interview. Nick, I want to thank you.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick.
The board will be meeting this evening and tomorrow evening, the schedule for a meeting, and I'll let you know status. Thanks on that.
You're gonna run back to Williamsburg?
Oh, man, no, today's rest day, you guys. Yeah, I guess we're good shape.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. Thank you.
It looks like
Best
we're
side.
back in business. John, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have our second candidate of the evening with us, Alex Lent. Alex, the board. So at this point, we want to thank you for your interest, Natalie, and congratulate you on being one of the 3 finalists for the position of town administrator. So this is an opportunity to take a few minutes to tell us about your history and your specific interest in this position and why you think you would be successful there.
Sure. Well, yes, I'm Alex Lent. Delighted to be back. I've been a Hadley neighbor for about 40 years between Amherst and Northampton and Deerfield and Petersham. So I'm delighted to be in consideration. I worry a little bit that as a librarian, I am the weirdo, oddball, outsider candidate. And I'd like to try as best I can to correct your thoughts on that. I do not have town administrator on my resume yet, but I've been a public administrator, a municipal department head, and a chief administrative officer reporting to an executive elected board for over a decade. I have tremendous personnel experience. People don't realize sometimes that libraries tend to have larger staffs than town halls. I've worked in union and non-union environments. I have a lot of facilities management and capital project experience. Libraries, again, we have to manage our own buildings. I also have strong financial experience, including as part of a 3-member committee that oversaw a town's entire budget, which at the time was about $120 million. I'm a good public speaker. I once got a standing ovation at a budget hearing, and that is online if anyone wants to check. That's a crowning achievement. I figured out a few years ago that I wanted to move into town administration. So I did an MPA in public management. I did my thesis on administration of small Massachusetts towns. I also have the Massachusetts Supervisory Leadership Development Program under my belt from UMass Boston. I also have another master's degree from Simmons in librarianship, and then a degree from UMass Amherst. I really love towns. I'm from a small town where you could really see the core operations of the town just because it was so small. So we have a town meeting environment, and I loved the energy and even just the core idea of residents coming together once or twice a year to collectively decide how to self-govern. I think that's just about the coolest thing in government today. Yeah, that's what brings me here.
Great, thank you. So how would you work with the board in understanding the vision of the board for the town? And what do you see as your role in that process, as well as setting the path for implementation?
Sure. It all comes down to clear communication. We're going to have a meeting about what the vision is, and we're going to clearly set goals and figure out who's doing what. And, the town administrator reports to the board. It's their job to facilitate communication and to follow the vision of the board. So, like I would with a focus group or an interview, there would be some guidance to sort of suss out what the vision is, help it be expressed in a way that's usable by residents and by employees. But this is largely a board-driven vision.
So you've mentioned your path, having been a librarian, and been successful for, many years doing that. And now you want to be a town administrator.
Mhm.
Talk about that a little bit more. What's that look like going into the future?
Sure. Well, in many ways, it's a very similar job. It's personnel management, it's board management, it's long and short-term goal setting. It's getting public feedback and recommending decisions that will impact how the organization is run. It seems odd to some folks, but there is precedent for library directors as just another municipal department head moving up the ranks to become town administrator. There was a senior center director who became a town administrator here, I think, and we see it all over the country. So I don't see it really as a career change. I see it as a broadening of scope. A lot of the challenges are very much the same. And when you're going from a, $2 or $4 million budget to a $20 to $25 million budget, the process is very, very similar. The numbers just look a little bit different, but it's understanding the limits, and working together to move in the same direction.
How many employees and what's the size of your budget right now?
Our budget's $2 million, and then we have about $1.5 million in additional funds, trusts, state aid, that kind of thing. We have 27 staff right now.
Okay. And so the board is in consensus here that leadership skills are critical.
Mhm.
So talk about the skills and the approach you would bring to the table to address this.
Yeah, I like a practical, grounded approach where the work really is understanding the people you're working with, understanding the goals ahead of you, understanding your situation and responding appropriately. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You have to understand what language works for one person, what are the core values of each person, why we're all here, why we're doing this work. Management is sort of trying to make your systems as efficient and effective as possible. Leadership is really about understanding all your people, understanding the goals, understanding the big picture, and making sure that we're all moving in the same direction.
You've done your research on this position.
Mhm.
Tell us about your understanding of this job. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities there?
Well, challenges, I guess, and opportunities would be the people. This is a people job. You're working for the people, under the people, with the people. So in any public administration effort, it's a people mess. People are complicated and confusing, and so I do see this largely as a person job. So to me, the opportunities come from the residents, maybe through the select board, but also directly through residents, understanding what we want our town to be and do, what we want to be able to do here that we're not able to do here, what are our core aspects that we want to protect and promote going forward, and how we balance all of these needs with financial situation that remains attractive, and maintaining service levels and potentially growing service levels. We increasingly see more and more wanted from our local government.
So you've worked with a couple of long-serving town administrators in the past, as well as a mayor who's probably the longest-serving mayor in the state right now.
Yeah.
And so what's the most single important characteristic of a leader of a community, do you think?
Doing your homework and being hugely involved in the community. I worked with Charlie Aspinwall, who's the recently retired town administrator for Canton, and before that in Millis. And Charlie is a very calm, steady person who, if you ask him a question, he'll give you the whole history, and he can spend as much time as you like on any given topic. And then we've got Mayor Mazzarella, who is, in terms of personality, very different than Charlie. Both great guys. But his style is more intuitive, where, I think I said before, I've never introduced someone to the mayor that he didn't already know. He just knows everybody in the community. He's been to every church. He's been to every restaurant. He probably knows your kids' birthdays. He's incredible. And he maintains that high level of visibility. He has a talk show and he's on Facebook Live every morning. I think he gets 45 minutes of sleep a night. It's incredible. So I do, we have Charlie, who has the sort of policy and practice precision. And then we have the mayor, who has just an incredible amount of experience and visibility and core understanding of his community. Charlie had core understanding of his community as well. And the mayor has great policy chops as well. But there's sort of a spectrum in the kind of approach you want to take. I do think I lean a little bit more towards Charlie, where I feel like elected officials get to have more personality than appointed employees. So I tend to go more towards the Charlie route. But I have been very lucky. I've worked for some really wonderful leaders.
The town takes a lot of pride in schools here, local school district. What do you see as a proper relationship between general government of town and the school district?
Respectful. I think we need to work as much as possible to understand each other's positions. It's common for at least a couple times a year the town to be pretty grumpy at how much the schools cost, and a lot of the year to be incredibly proud of the schools. And you're proud when you're grumpy as well. And on the other side, you've got teachers who are always working incredibly hard on limited resources. And from the town side, sometimes we think, how could you possibly have limited resources? We're giving you 65% of our budget. But empathy and understanding and as much collaboration as possible. In a city environment, the mayor is often on the school committee. That's not really the case in town environments. But I think there should be as much collaboration as there can be. One thing that we did that was effective in Danvers was to have a core budget team made up of the school superintendent, the library director, and the town manager. And that really let us see that the big picture is shared among all three board subordinates. And time spent together, understanding. Your town administrator should probably read to some classes at the school, internships back and forth. I think it's a person challenge.
The town is looking for someone who, can understand innovation, be a creative problem solver. What are the latest trends, in municipal government, and how does that, what are some of those trends, and how does that potentially play in, the future here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a bunch of trends now. One that excites me because it parallels libraries is trying to get into the community and kind of have pop-up town halls. This works especially well in a place where you have historic villages, Hardwick could be a good example where it's really a small town with a surprising number of villages for such a small town. And you can, say on Monday, we're going to be in this region, here we're going to be at this old church, et cetera. I'm trying to get out and connect directly. It's kind of a throwback as well, because over the past really 20 years, we've pushed more and more online, trying to get more done without human contact. And I understand that, and certainly COVID didn't help. Self-service governance is appealing. It's sort of like the self-check at Target. If you can do it yourself, you can get in and get out, be nice and quick. I think the trend that appeals to me most at this point is kind of a reversal of that, where we have kind of a concierge approach, where someone comes in to town hall and there's someone there to guide them to the department they're going to, really help them find the resources they want, and have that personal touch. It's almost like having a school advisor. That one I like a lot. It doesn't really work at, say, in Manhattan, but in a place like Petersham or Hadley, you can have that personal connection. And I think that's incredibly important. I would also like to see more towns getting rid of social media, because I think it is an unnecessary evil, but I don't think anyone's coming along with me on that one.
Let's talk about the finance side of the house. So,
Sure.
Describe a little bit more, being a library director, I think the first thought might be, well, maybe, the finances might be an area you haven't, but you were part of this troika, you were talking about in Danvers. So let's talk about your finance experience, and how would you go about taking a budget here, 20 departments and putting it together?
Yeah. Great question. I think starting from the biggest possible picture and narrowing in over the course of your budget season is important. I also think it's really important to assume that at all times you're talking to the public. One thing we see all the time is budgets or budget lines even that are trying to do too many things, where you see a budget of, $500,000 and you've got 4 budget lines. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Having some structure, having clearly defined budget lines, having standardized budget lines between departments so that you can collapse the whole budget into one budget, because it's really one budget, and having it clear enough that you can bring your neighbor in and say, here's what we're thinking of doing for the budget. Here's the money coming in. Here's our required expenditures. Here's our optional stuff. Here's the stuff that's, really, really important, but we can probably push off for a year or two. Having these clear categories, it really, really should not be hidden behind jargon and overly complicated. Always we see budgets getting on to like 75 pages. And I guess there's a lot of narrative that goes with them, but very few of your town meeting members are going to have read a 75-page budget. I think it's important to have a narratively true, but as simple as possible budget, so you can have a meaningful conversation about it with whomever you're talking to, whether that's the finance director or whether it's someone who's upset that taxes are going up. You should be able to have a clear conversation with anyone, and you should assume that you're having a conversation with the public at all times.
Talking about, as part of that, financial forecasting and financial policies, for the community.
Yeah. I was at a budget hearing once, and I was saying, here's what we project our outputs to be for the next couple of years. And we had a new select board member who, this was back in Millis, who was saying, but how do you know? We were going through the math and saying, well, we don't know. And he was adamant that we didn't know. And he was absolutely right. Knowledge is an illusion, and future knowledge is doubly so. So what you can do is, we have tremendous data. Even someone who is just a resident has access to tremendous data from the Division of Local Services, and from analogous organizations in other states. There's just a tremendous amount of information out there. we can project it reasonably. And actually in Massachusetts with Prop 2.5, it's easier to project than it is in other states because we have these, for better or for worse, strict guide rails. So we can say, well, based on this, we think this is going to happen. But you don't know. You absolutely don't know. So being transparent about the lack of clarity is very important, and saying, if we go this way where we don't do an override, here's what our taxes are going to, and new growth is obviously challenging. But if new growth continues to decline in the way that we've seen it over the past 8 or so years, here's what we think. If we're able to make this deal happen, and it's similar to what happened with the plaza in Barrie, we can say, well, they saw this boost. So there's lots of data, and you should have realistic projections. And I think you should have a range of projections. If things go really, really well, this. If things go really, really poorly, this. If the state maintains the lessons they've learned from the Great Recession and they continue to give good state support to municipalities, or if they forget those lessons and they try to reel back in and pass the debt along, here's what's that's going to look like. I also think, there are something like 19,500 municipalities in the United States, most of which are roughly Hadley's size. 75% are less than 10,000, 63% are less than 5,500. We should not be looking just at Massachusetts or New England. There are lessons to be learned all over the place. And, the government's pretty obsessed with data these days. There's a lot to learn. Yeah.
So how would you come in here and immerse yourself into the finances and the budget, here in Hadley?
I think I would have to dive right in. I've been swimming in your budget a little bit, as best I could from the outside. I think it's, budget season is upon us. Town meeting is upon us. I'm going to dive right in. And I think talking to the people who have been here before, watching the meetings where budgets have been discussed, reading the minutes, understanding the main problems, and then reflecting to not just the most informed people in town hall, but also to residents. This is what I'm taking away from our budget experience right now. Does this line up with your experience? Active listening, trying to line up, make sure that you are understanding the budget in the way that other people think you ought to be understanding the budget. But yeah, a lot of talking. People will get pretty sick of me asking them about their budget lines. I also think we learn a lot just by going through the budget lines, saying, why is it like this? Why is it like this? Does anyone else use this budget code? Why are you doing this? Every time I've looked at a budget, it's been similar. You build a budget and you feel good about it, and it took you months and months and months. And then everyone goes off and uses the budget, and you get it back at the end, and it's like a high school theater curtain. It's just all over the place. That's normal, but the process of, you learn a lot by doing it. Yeah.
You were asked to do a presentation.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to explain it, for the public, and reiterate, as I did the first time, this is a scenario I put together, so that no one's thinking that this is a scenario that the town's facing. But the board asked that you take, assume that you are the current town administrator, and the powers to be have determined that a levy limit override is necessary. The levy limit override will be needed to balance the budget to maintain current service levels for the schools and general government. So please make a presentation as to the options for the town to proceed with the $800,000 levy limit override, and a recommendation for a plan for the town to present and communicate this request to the citizens. The board has your handout.
Yep.
So this is your opportunity to talk to the board as to that presentation.
Great. Yes, you've got my homework in front of you. Luckily, Leominster blue is the same as Hadley blue, so we were able to color code a little bit. Yes, this was really fun and very interesting, and doubly so because it was currently hypothetical and not real. So that's nice. This was given to me as an override problem. I've kind of tried to recenter that as a shortfall problem. Because in my mind, the real problem here is that we don't have enough money. If we go for an override, sure. If we find a way to do it otherwise, that's fine. But the core problem is we need $800,000. So I've recentered it a little bit there. And for good measure, I threw up my favorite frugality quote: use it up, wear it out, make it do without. This is something we say in my house. My kids love it. And so I thought I would share it here. So I do have 5 items that I recommend as part of a strategy here. The first one is make sure you're right. Check your math, check with the DLS, check with the MMA, connect with your peer organizations. Make sure they're seeing what you're seeing, and especially those organizations that have been in this position either now or in the past. And there are quite a number of communities that are in this situation right now. Get their input. If we're right, and there's an $800,000 shortfall, the next step, and these are not necessarily in order, you're going to be doing a lot of these all the time, but the next thing would be to communicate. We need to make the shortfall known to the public as immediately as we possibly can. This is not something you want to surprise your residents with. You do need to get it out. So I would recommend having a budget blog or some sort of clearinghouse that can be easily updated on your website that provides all of the current information. And I'd want to see that updated very regularly. I'd want to have weekly office hours. I would do this anyway, but weekly office hours where I invite folks to come and talk to me about budget situation. Monthly public forum in order to, if it is going to be an override, we want to get ahead of it as much as possible. And we don't want to wait for the last minute to propose an override. Social media, for all its evils, is a good way to engage with people. Similarly, email list, and then an affordable way to connect with people who are not on those lists is through postcards. And actively solicit input from vocal opponents to a tax increase. I don't think we'll have trouble finding those folks, but getting them involved is incredibly important. So basically the goal here is to lay out the situation as clearly as possible, lay out your options, concisely explain what led to this situation, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but provide paths to avoid it in the future. So then we get to mitigate. All of these kind of rhyme, which I apologize for. So this is essentially a list of things that you ought to do before you do an override. Prop 2.5 does not prevent you from raising taxes more than 2.5%, but it makes it difficult, and it suggests that you increase revenue otherwise, reduce costs, increase regionalization, et cetera. So increase your local tax options: meal tax, lodging tax, marijuana tax. We've done all this here. We could advocate for the Municipal Empowerment Act, which is floating around the state house right now, which gives us a little bit more oomph on these areas. Again, fees for services is something that Prop 2.5 wants us to do. A good example of this is the transfer station. I would say our transfer station fees are pretty high already. And then debt exclusions. These have historically done a lot better in Hadley than overrides, which I believe overrides are 0 for 8 right now. People like them more because they're not permanent. And it's a good strategy. And depending on the specific nature of the shortfall, there's a lot we can push off into a debt exclusion, capital items. This is the one that I'm assuming everyone will hate, which is a commercial tax rate increase. We have thankfully very low taxes here, but we have one tax rate. So Target's paying at the same rate as individual residents, which to me is a little bit bananas. That is the default situation across Massachusetts. It's not unusual at all. But a place like Target has real, and not to pick on Target, but imagine some imaginary big box store, let's call it Target. They impact our infrastructure a lot more than a resident does. So in my mind, it makes good sense for them to pay a premium for that. The problem is that we don't want to overtax our farmers. So we would need to work with farmers, assessors, legal counsel to identify the best opportunities for each farm. Maybe that's 60 chapter lands. Maybe it's an APR. Maybe it's trying to classify as mixed use so that only a little bit of your farm is considered commercial and everything else is, something else. Long term, I think we need to advocate at the state level for a common sense solution to the agricultural taxation. It's bananas that we have an easy commercial rate. We can just say, well, I'm Target, I'm Chick-fil-A, I get this commercial rate. And then farmers either get mixed in with that or they have to lawyer up and do all of this work to, okay, maybe this is my soapbox that we don't need to get onto. Anyway, I would advocate for re-examining the commercial tax rate and doing what we can to protect our farms. Careful use of stabilization and free cash. Obviously, we don't want to do too much here. It's not good for our credit rating and we need to have that money. Reduce spending. We've done some of this. We can do it again. I'd like to centralize purchasing as much as possible. I don't want 20 departments buying paper. I want the town buying paper in large quantities and enjoying the cost savings from that larger buying. We can defer spending where possible. We can defer spending where it's barely possible as well. That's a common one. And I think we should explore new regionalization opportunities. The big scary ones are schools and police. That's not what I'm talking about. There are much more acceptable options such as snow remediation, assessing, planning, HR, establishing or reestablishing a regionalization opportunities task force and using public forums as a venue to generate additional strategies. I think these are good practical solutions. And at this point, we will really optimistically recalculate our shortfall. Hopefully it's just gone. That would be swell. And then we can just move right along. If we still need to do an override, we get into the advocacy phase where we need to reframe the override with specifics. It would be less effective to say we're doing a tax override than it would be to say we're increasing your taxes from 1158 to 1201. Really specific, show that it's really not that much, or it's not as much as it might feel like it is. Comparing your inflation since 1980, which is when Prop 2.5 was approved but not put into effect, with budget growth since 1980 to show the major issue. Mapping Massachusetts override votes so we can see how common this is. Connecting with other communities that have passed overrides after voting them down repeatedly. Again, the DLS has all this information. It's very easy to find neighbors who are in this situation. Comparing tax rates a chunk of years out with the override versus without an override can also help. Also noting the possibility of future underride or excess levy capacity as goals. It's easy to say that overrides are permanent, and they can be, certainly. They don't have to be. I think there have been something like 4,600 override or underride votes in Massachusetts history in the past 40-ish years. And I think 36 of them were underride votes. So it's not that common, but it is not impossible. You can return to lower taxation. And then building connections with local organizations and attending a wide variety of meetings, getting out into the public and explaining the situation, getting feedback, hearing people is incredibly important. And then anticipation, developing a plan to avoid overrides in the future. Obviously, this is something that we've been doing all the time. We're always trying to avoid overrides, but being very explicit about it and talking with people about the plan, bringing them into it can be a good way to vent some of the frustration and to come up with real solutions. Minimizing also quarterly department level budget check-ins. People will love these, where we really go over the budget repeatedly. Minimizing avoidable end of year spending. My staff calls this library Christmas. I really hate that term where, sometimes we've had a vacancy. And so it takes us a month or two to fill an important vacancy. And so we have 2 months worth of salary. One strategy is to transfer it from personnel to operating so that you can take on projects that you didn't think you'd be able to or offset costs. Not doing that and instead turning unused funds over to the general fund is a better financial idea. Developing and adhering to a capital improvement plan, simplifying our budgets, planning for yearly budget decreases until we can not rely on new growth as much. And then spinning off a multi-town nonprofit to collaboratively provide shareable services. Places like FERCog, RRG, and other organizations, MHEC kind of. There are ways to regionalize without losing the control over our own services that feel important in terms of maintaining the character of our community. Does that make sense?
So you talk about capital planning, talk about your capital planning approach.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe some large projects you've been involved with over time.
Sure. My capital planning approach is to do as much of it as you possibly can. So we do 5-year plans every year. And theoretically, we're not recreating the wheel every year. We're saying, well, now this is theoretically 4 years away. And is it really? So, we have master plans that we do every so often. I think capital plans really should be done at least yearly. And then tracking all of your spending extremely clearly as well, so that you can see how long it's been since you've spent this much on a roof, and trying to build that into your expectations. I said this last time, but I have replaced the roof of every library I've ever directed. I don't know what's happening with library roofs, but that's my most recent project. We spent about $750,000 replacing our roof. We're going to be doing about $300,000 in repairs to our envelope, which is basically the roof, but the side of the building. And similarly, with some of our grounds need to be regraded and things like that. So again, it all comes down to understanding the situation as much as possible, as early as possible. When you're late, it's going to cost more, and you're going to have to use up your stabilization, which you don't want to do. ARPA is not going to come around again anytime soon. So being able to have your nest eggs, that's why we don't want to go whole hog on our stabilization and free cash. We really want to use that as a Band-Aid solution when capital items come up that we weren't aware of, which always will happen. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Great.
Kind of.
Okay, it's not for me to say.
Okay.
So moving on, HR. So you mentioned 23 employees.
27.
So 27. So you got 27 employees. Talk about your relationship on the HR side.
Yeah.
And handling that, and then basically taking the next step into the entire organization. How does that translate? Leading the HR side of the organization.
Leading the HR side of the organization?
Well, basically, you're going to be coming into a unit with 20 departments, so you're involved with one aspect. So talk about your collective bargaining and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So HR and personnel management, I've immediately lost my train of thought. It's probably the most consistently difficult aspect of any kind of leadership job is managing the people. People are complex and messy and frequently irritating and difficult. So, you have to have policies in place that set expectations. You've got to onboard carefully. You've got to be very visible to your staff and encourage your subordinates to be very visible with their staffs, so that we're not having, the real problems come when there's a lack of communication, or things are happening in isolation without proper awareness. So preventing that awareness gap is crucial. And, having best practices in place in terms of performance improvement plans and disciplinary policies. And, unions are fantastic for this because, I feel like people feel about unions the way we feel about Prop 2.5, are like, oh, these darn rules, but the rules are actually incredibly beneficial. They give you this guideline that forces you to do things properly. So yeah, working with your HR team, making sure that you have your core documents in place, having procedures and training for your staff. Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, have you participated in collective bargaining yourself? or-
I've negotiated for changes, but I haven't done the whole community by myself. Yeah.
in HR today, what are some of the key issues that need to be addressed?
Well, this is a great opportunity to complain about social media again. We do see issues around social media where people are too active or they're posting things they shouldn't be. But the core issues are, I think, relatively steady historically. It's interpersonal conflicts, lack of balance and boundaries. These are sort of classic problems that sometimes are made more confusing by a hybrid workplace, or we often see hierarchies that are ambiguous. I wouldn't really say that HR challenges have evolved tremendously. I think people are people and they've been difficult the whole time. I think we have higher standards of acceptable behavior at work, and having that clarified is important, and having people aware of the rules and aware of your handbook and your guidance is critically important.
So talk about three important qualities when you're hiring somebody. Talk about three important qualities you are seeking when you're hiring an employee.
It depends on the position. I like to see people think in interviews. I like to see how game they are for thinking on the spot and coming up with creative solutions. So I do like creativity. I like emotional management. I like people to be able to be aware of what they're feeling and what other people are feeling, and choosing how to react rather than just reacting. So I would connect that with patience, creativity, and I do want to see people with a good reason for wanting to work here. The public sector is not for everyone. There are wonderful reasons to be in the public sector. I think it's the place to be. There's, serving your community is incredibly satisfying. It's a net positive, but it's not for everyone. So, we want to understand the values of the people who are looking for positions here, and making sure that they align with our organizational values. Yeah.
How do you deal with a subordinate who is not a team player?
Ideally, you would start by connecting with them one-on-one and saying, here's what I'm seeing and here's the impact it's having. Our expectations, and this shouldn't be a surprise based on job description and realities of the job, is XYZ. We need you to build strong, productive relationships with your coworkers and your subordinates and your superiors. And we need you to understand that this is not a one-person show. This is a collaborative effort. Hopefully that, we'll meet again in a month. I want to see what you think about that. If it continues to happen, this eventually becomes a performance improvement situation with coaching. And depending on the nature of the issue, it could be a behavioral issue rather than a performance issue. But you should have disciplinary and corrective policies in place that will guide you through that. But typically it's a check-in, some coaching, and then we get into potentially warnings or reassignment to see if we can apply their skills differently so that we're keeping them and still getting good use out of their skills without causing an over disruption.
There's kind of two Hadleys here. one,
Yeah.
the Route 9 section, on the other side, very much commercially based. About, a little over 30%, of, taxes from that. How would you approach economic development? Coming into the community, you have very, residential Hadley and very commercial Hadley. How do you blend the two going forward?
To me, it's about the residents, it's about the voters, it's about the long-term character of the community. So I do think the master planning model is important. I think we could do it more frequently. I believe the law says it's updated from time to time. I don't really like that line. I think it's important to have not a continual, but pretty close conversation with representative groups of residents about planning and zoning and trying to do this in as natural and intuitive a way as you possibly can. We don't need citizens to have deep knowledge of how overlays work, but we do need them to say, know why we have a corridor of commercial. And that's not going to take over the whole town. That's sort of a sacrificial corridor to protect our agricultural land, our community. Also, it's a state road, so we have less control over it. So we may as well make that the commercial area. So yeah, I think for me, it's all about the residents. It's all about the folks who are going to be here a long time, and it's got to be an ongoing conversation. I think the master plan is from 2017. I want to get that at least an update every 10 years. But yeah, it's got to be an ongoing process, and it's got to, people need to be aware of it as well. We see this all the time where someone will go down the street, they'll park and they'll go, oh, there's a Costco here now. How did I not know that? How did you not know that? That's something that we should all be aware of, that major changes are coming. Yeah, so I think it's got to be an ongoing conversation. And I do lean towards emphasizing the residents over commercial aspects, certainly.
Communications has been big in libraries. So coming over, to general government side, communications is ever changing. What type of tools, what type of, best practices can you bring, for general government to communicate with its citizens?
Okay. Yeah, it's challenging even inside the government, with your employees, you can say, well, I know Meredith prefers in-person meetings, and I know that Richard prefers to get things by email and then meet afterwards so he has time to digest. You don't get to do that with the public. So really, the easiest way is email blasts, but we almost never have a real sizable email list for the whole community. Always it's patching things together where, we've convinced these 3 churches to send out an email blast of theirs. We've got the historical commission doing theirs. The schools said they would, but they haven't done it in the past. So we'll see what happens. It's always this piecemeal effort. So it is a lot of work. There's a reason that town meeting has to be announced by post, which is expensive and irritating. But it's kind of the only consistent way to get to people. And, I know in Petersham, our notices are about this big, and they say when and where. It's always the same place. We have like 4 buildings in Petersham. And that's all you get. So sometimes you need to communicate about more complex issues. And that's sort of what I was getting at in my my bit about communication is you should be using as many avenues as you can. There's language that you can use in different formats. But yeah, you've got people who just sleep in Hadley, and you've got people who are very active in Hadley, and you've got to find a way to communicate with all of them. I tend to like to think of, the press release still as the core of public communications, where you can say, this is the official release. We've got it on our website. We've got it through all of our normal venues. We work with the newspapers such as they are. I mean, we do our best, but increasingly, if we can build the email list, that's really the way to go. Though I am told that the new generation does not read their email and they just want texts, which is just fantastic. So we'll have to figure out how to text people press releases in 140 characters. No, yeah, it's a balancing act because you really the best way, and we see this even with survey research, is everyone wants to do everything on paper, really. You want to have the information in front of you. I mean, if you're going to read it, it's going to be on paper in front of you. That's incredibly expensive. So it's making sacrifices, it's doing your best, and it's dedicating a large amount of your time to getting the word out. That's why I said, we've got to announce the shortfall, the hypothetical shortfall immediately, and start talking to people as early as possible because it is a ton of work. And even if you do a state leading public relations effort, there's going to be people who come to town meeting and say, "Oh, I didn't know that we all could go to town meeting. I thought it was representative." Like, come on, man. It's been like this for 200 years. Yeah, it's an uphill battle. It is fun, especially if you can do the face-to-face stuff. I think that's really rewarding. Yeah, it's a pain.
How do you go about resolving conflicts and disputes? In this position, it occurs a little more often than it should. But how do you go about, resolving those? And give us an example when you had to deal with a public situation like that.
Oh, a public situation. Well, the first step is gathering all the information you can possibly gather about the situation. Let me think about the public one we had recently. We had a First Amendment audit a couple of years ago.
No.
Yeah. Which was, it went so close to going perfectly, and then it really went off the rails at the end. And we subsequently were inundated with calls from theoretically residents, but really YouTubers all over the world who felt that the thing they thought they saw was inappropriate. And that really just wasn't the facts of the matter. So, explaining that as best we could, certainly to our local residents, was an exercise in patience and, people, sometimes things take longer to understand than people want to give you. That doesn't mean that I can go faster. Sometimes this is going to take a little while to review this. We've got 1,000 people in the building right now. I've got to get this information. I'll give you updates when I have them. Laying out what you feel to be the truth of the matter, speaking with your legal advisors as needed. But the core of it really is remaining calm, understanding the situation. And if you get a clear-cut answer, which is, I'd love to say is 60% of the time, but I don't know that it's that high, is being able to say, well, this is unacceptable for our organization based on our code of conduct, et cetera. And here's what the results of this are. It's not always punitive. Sometimes we're going to make sure that this person understands how we speak to residents going forward, or how we diffuse a situation going forward. And that tends to be it. We can't give all the information about personnel matters out to the public. We've got exemption C for that. So it's really understanding and communication. It happens. I mean, you get enough people, something's going to go awry.
We've got a little less than 10 minutes to go. So before I get into the final section on water relationships, I want to see if the board has any questions you wish to pursue at this time.
Do you have much experience looking for grants and public funds?
I do. Yeah, that's a big one for us. We've been lucky in Leominster. We have a dedicated grants person who works for the whole city, which is an incredible model. We also do things independently, department by department. I do like to see, I'd like to see as much consolidation of fundraising efforts as possible so that we don't get multiple people good-naturedly going to the same organizations and conflicting with each other when, sometimes there's a way to collaborate. Sometimes there's a project that's clearly more valuable to the community than another one. So yeah, I've had good luck with that, including with private fundraising, but yeah, coordination and encouraging people to get involved. There are occasionally you run into someone who really loves doing grant work. I think more often than not, it's people aren't crazy about it, but for a community of this size, you need more than one person working on it, I think.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So you've worked for basically boards,
Yep.
through library trustees. What's a good relationship look like, with that? And how do you handle communications, with the board? It would be a little bit different at this, at this point, but, how would you handle that?
I like to have clearly defined roles. In Massachusetts libraries, we have guiding documents that sort of line up what is a trustee role, what's a library director role, where there's ambiguity that you have to solve yourself. And we have the same thing from the Mass Municipal Association for select board and then CAO relationships. So following those best practices, and when there is confusion, being able to clearly to say, I'm not sure how we need to handle this situation, so let's talk this out so that when we see it again, we have a better understanding. That's just part of the job is figuring out who does what and trying to come up with reasonable, practical solutions. In terms of communication, public records law limits us a little bit. I like to have sort of official communication that is a written packet that goes to the board before each meeting that we then discuss at the meeting. We also make that public as needed. And then when something goes awry, usually my first call is to my board chair so we can be on the same page, and to the mayor so that we can all be on the same page. And then as resolution approaches, there would be more official communication to the entire board as appropriate to keep us all on the same page. Because really the name of the game is don't surprise your board.
So let's say you've been here 1 year from now, you've been the town administrator. What do you think, you would want to report out as to your accomplishments, in that first year? And I'm not talking project wise.
Not
project wise, but, the leadership issues of what have you been able to accomplish?
I'd like to have met an enormous percentage of our residents, and I'd like to have folks feeling in the building, feeling stable and safe in terms of leadership, that they can come to me and to an extent come to the board to talk about what's going on in their departments. So I want that steadiness. I want that predictability. I want folks to feel that they're being communicated with in an expected and sufficient manner. I want them to feel just a little bit like I stop by and visit too much, just a touch too much, and I can, just back off a little bit. Maybe once a month rather than once a week visits would be preferable. And then I guess this is more of a project, but I would like to be able to say we've simplified these procedures, really looking at the budget, saying we've been able to make this more public friendly, and we're able to have good, productive, practical conversations with residents when they come in. I'd also like to have a strong practice of office hours where the public can come in, even if it's the same 3 gentlemen who come in every week to talk. I want that regularity where town administrator is accessible as much as possible.
Okay, great. So if there's no other questions from the board, I'm going to ask Alex to give a closing statement to the board at this time. So.
Well, again, I'm delighted to be back. This is a town I really do admire. It's a position I'm excited about. I think it's a position that my skills lend themselves to. And thank you for your consideration. If there's anything I can answer to make you feel more confident in hiring a librarian as town administrator, please let me know.
Great. So the board will be concluding its interviews tonight, and they're scheduled for tonight and tomorrow for discussion on the matter. And I'll let you know status as we go forward.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Everybody ready?
Yep.
All right, John, take it away.
Thank you,
Again.
Mr. Chair. We have our third candidate of the evening. Nate Lloyd is third candidate. So we're going to start with first of all, thank you for your interest here in Hadley, and congratulations on being one of 3 finalists for the position. So why don't you take a few minutes and tell us about your history and your specific position, interest in this position, and why do you think you would be successful in?
Sure. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Nate Malloy. I live in South Deerfield. I've lived there for about 10 years. Previously, it was Turner's. I grew up in Greenfield, and I moved back after moving away to Colorado and Boston. I moved back actually to get a dual degree at UMass in planning and landscape architecture. And I really wanted to just, have my career and my family here. And so, that's what I've done. I've worked in Amherst for almost 17 years. As the article said, I was shocked at how long it's been. I still remember starting as a graduate student intern, and I've been there, for a long time now, and I really appreciate what I've learned in Amherst. I really like this area. So, I'm kind of rooted here. I want to be able to have, my kids move back here and enjoy what I have. There's so much to offer in the Pioneer Valley and Hadley and in Amherst in this area. So, for me, I've been in Amherst for a long time. I don't really look for job opportunities very often. I find it to be a lot of work. I want to put myself into it. I want to take the time to actually know what I'm doing. And so, I didn't apply to this right away, to be honest. I read the description. I talked to my wife. I mulled it over, and we said, "Is this a good opportunity?" And we agreed it was, both personally and professionally. I want to stay in the area. I don't really want to move outside the Pioneer Valley. I don't really want to leave and move to another state. I want to stay here. And I think professionally, I'm ready to be a mentor, to be a leader. To work with a small community. And so, I chose to apply to Hadley. And so, I feel, I'm lucky to be here. Thanks for having me and sitting through a few hours of interviews. And and I put my best foot forward and myself into my position, my job. I feel like it's becomes a part of me.
So with that, how would you work with the board in understanding the vision of the board for the town? And what do you see as your role in that process, as well as setting a path for implementation?
Sure. So, you have your mission statement. The town has many plans and documents, your master plan. How do you go about envisioning those goals? I think I would want to meet with, select board members individually, meet with planning board members, finance committees, boards and committees, and work, professionally and personally with, with each member. And so I think I think we could get along personally. We don't have to see eye to eye, but I think professionally we can, work together well. So, there's a member of the Amherst Town Council who says, "Nate, I think you're great. I know we don't see eye to eye, but we can always have a dialogue and we can respect each other." And so to me, that's a really great compliment. We don't have to agree on everything, but I'd like to have a great professional relationship. And so, I meet with department heads, get to know the community. Although I've worked in Amherst, I still feel like there's a lot I need to learn about Hadley and about the select board. So I take that time, get to know every one of you individually, and like I said, professionally as well. So whether that's through meetings, different communications, and really build up those relationships.
So talk about your time a little bit in Amherst. You've been there for several years now. And what was your path, there? And what do you see as your path going forward? You want to be a town administrator? Right. What is, talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So, I really enjoy planning, site planning, the systems of things. And so, you realize that when you want to start making changes, sometimes, you have to leave what you started as, right? So, to develop policies and guidelines, sometimes it's no longer being the planner, it's being, whether it's a director level position or moving yourself away from what you started as. And so I see, becoming a town administrator as part of that transition. So how do I take the skills I've learned? How do I keep growing and adapting and being a leader and a mentor and learning from the community that I'm working with? And so, what I've learned in Amherst is to be attentive, to be assertive when necessary. And realize that, the planning is about the community and about the people. And so how do you, put your best foot forward, put, the zoning, the policy, the regulations forward to improve the community as they see it. And so that's how I'd work with Hadley is, listen to the community, listen to the select board, and how do we move forward together?
So the board is in consensus here that leadership skills are critical, on this hire. Talk about the skills and the approach you'll bring to the table in order to address this.
Sure. Yeah. I think I'd want to listen and learn first. I'd be attentive. I'd want to determine, what are the decision-making points and how, what do you want to see in a leader? So I think having clear feedback channels, having whether it's annual reviews or even, informal meetings as I start, leaning on the resources that are here. I think there's good staff in the community. And so, how do I learn from them and understand what they would like in a leader? And then, take that to, start charting a path, with the select board. So, what are your policies? What are your visions for the community? And how do I implement those? How do I work with you, with town staff, with the community? And so, I think a lot of it would be listening and learning at first, and then, finding my role in that. How do I facilitate things? How do I get things done? Is it, calling more meetings, being available to the public and to boards and committees? And so, as it works now, I staff different boards and committees over my time. I, manage grants, projects, different roles in the community, different consultants on community projects. And so how do you facilitate all that and keep things moving forward?
So being in the neighborhood, what's your understanding of this job? You said you've done your research here. So what's the understanding of this job relative to the challenges and the opportunities for you?
Sure. Yeah, I think, a lot of communities in this area are kind of at an inflection point with the budget, with what's happening in terms of, school enrollment, loss of school-age children, economic development. So how do you work with that and keep the community the way people want to see it? So I think Hadley, and I've heard you mention tonight, there's 2 Hadleys. There could be more, but I do see Hadley as having, great farmland and open space. You have the river and you have strong economic development in a commercial corridor. So how do you maintain those and maintain the schools? And so, I'd want to, work with the community to update a master plan. The housing production plan is pretty new. An open space and rec plan, right? I think you're working on a historic preservation plan. So how do you tie all those together, integrate those plans with the goals of the select board? And how do you keep offering high level government services and keep the community functioning? So I see my role as being a facilitator, maybe being a mediator if necessary, and, also a leader, right? So how can I be at the forefront of some of these issues and make sure the community understands what the goals are? So they may not like them at first, right? They might not like some ideas, but how can they understand it? How can I be a clear and concise communicator? How can we make things, understandable to the community? And so they might not like the idea of, say, having certain housing in town, but is that economic development? Is that growth? And so how can you be, transparent and clear about that? And, some of it would be the understanding. It might mean additional meetings, or how do you get the community to understand why you're doing something, whether or not they like it?
So based on your experience and observation, what do you think is single most important characteristic of an effective town administrator?
Sure. Yeah. I would say there has to be a multitude of things, maybe not just a single one. I think being a good listener, being introspective is important. I think also being assertive, like I said, when necessary. So John Musanti was a town manager in Amherst. He came from a financial background. He was conservative financially, but when he had big visions, he pushed for it. He knew when to corral support, when to kind of push those ideas forward. So he liked the idea of green infrastructure before green communities was around, and he wanted to put that in the budget. So I think being aware of what the responsibilities are as a community, what some goals are as stated in various plans, and how do you move those forward when the timing's right? And so I think that's something I work with the select board on doing.
Okay. And the town takes a lot of pride in its school district here, and schools are important. What's a good relationship look like, or what's a proper relationship between general government and the schools?
Sure. Yeah. I think for the longest time, communities thought school-age children were maybe a double burden, right? They use the schools, they cost, drain resources, cost money. But to me, I see them as the lifeblood of a community. And so I think having a really strong relationship with the schools, both the principal and superintendent, being, collaborative, having meetings. If you look at the school enrollment projections for Hadley and the area, I mean, they're decreasing a lot in 20 years. And so to me, I think the school is really important. It's really what is part of the community. It's, where people meet on the weekends now, they, maybe it used to be church and now it's, you meet at the school playground or at a playing field or at an event. So how do you make that integral part of the community? It's difficult when it's budget time, right? So schools cost a lot of money, but I think they're a really big part of the community. And so I think having a really good relationship with the administration there is important.
So with times changing, innovation and creative problem solving, might be something we look towards more and more going forward. What do you talk about some of the latest trends in municipal government, that you might want to take a look at, as maybe being pertinent, to a situation of today?
Sure. Yeah. I had the benefit of listening to the 2 previous interviews and, I don't know if that's better or worse. I think, it's been mentioned, shared services. I think that's important. I think knowing when to regionalize some services. So I know Hadley, you're trying to capitalize your ambulance service and it's a way to, subsidize the fire department in a bit. But, can, first responders and EMS be regionalized in some way to offset costs? And maybe Hadley's the lead in it, but, how do you share those costs and that, actually that service with other communities? Amherst, we've implemented online permitting. And so some of it is streamlining permitting, having a central repository for information. Any documents can be scanned and uploaded there. I've listened to some meetings here, so I know you've talked about kind of a document storage retention policy and practice. And so, I used to keep paper packets of every meeting. So I have boxes of every meeting packet for the Historical Commission for years. And the question is, what do you do with those? And so, the online permitting, it's not only that, it's it could serve as a document center where you upload everything and store it. So I think that's important, adapting to allowing people to apply at home for permits. It makes it easy. And in Amherst, we've been doing, the town manager's been doing a cup of joe. So you actually get out there and have, office hours in the community. I think that's really important. So I think things can be done electronically and remotely, but I think having, it's a people facing role, right? We're public service, we serve the community. So having office hours, not just in town hall, but outside in the community is really important. I think a work-life balance is also important. So I think that's, how do you manage that? How do you attract and retain good employees at a local level to make them feel supported? And so I think, it's something I think is a challenge with small governments and small communities. I think it's something that can be done.
So what's been your involvement in the financial side?
Sure.
You're a planner, so talk about the finance, side of things. What's been your involvement and how do you translate that involvement into now being in charge of the budget of 20 departments?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working in the planning department. We're now the Office of Conservation and Development. So it's inspections, health, conservation, planning, and sustainability. So it's multiple departments in one. Typically my role is limited to the planning department budget. So we, put in capital requests. We look at what are the next 5 to 10 years of services. What does the operating budget look like? I do apply for and manage grants. So I manage about $2 million in grants annually, the block grant, park and land grants, Mass Works. And so often we have, an interdepartmental team that meets quarterly, at least to determine how do we structure grants and pay for those and what does staff look like? And so, we often, and CPA money, right? So how do we make all those work, looking at capital projects and budgeting? And so with block grant, we pay for, 2 positions actually with our block grant funding, as well as capital projects and social services. So, each year I sit down with the planning department and in the office and determine how does that fit into the budget. So, I follow the town's budget process. It is an annual cycle and, how do you look at the operating and capital and how do you, make that work each year? So, I'm a part of that in terms of the planning department.
So describe that a little bit more on the capital side and the budgeting side. You say you're a part of that. What does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, like I said, we apply for a grant. The town applies for grants. I used to be the sole person who applied for most grants for the town. It's now distributed amongst departments, which is nice. but I still apply for a fair number of grants. And so often we'll meet and look at, how can we, supplement the town's budget, looking at capital projects. So, are there roads that need improvement, whether it's, the paving? And so is there a Mass Works grant or a certain grant that can supplement the budget? There's water and sewer lines that need fixing, can block grant money be used for that? Is it in a low income, eligible neighborhood? Is it a priority on the plan, in the plans? And so, some of it is, that kind of that small piece, but looking at, what else can we do to get that going? Can we use CPA money creatively to fund projects or seed housing projects? And so, the town doesn't necessarily fund them, but we facilitate the development and we'll fund some of them, but we're not a subsidizing agent. But
What type of fiscal philosophy you bring to the table in developing budget?
yeah, I think, I think Amherst has had a conservative approach. I think it bears well. I think sometimes you have to realize, what are your projections? What's the future growth and what are your opportunities for development? And, some of it would be, what kind of community is Hadley? Is it a, 2% community, a 3%? So what's kind of the growth in revenue and how can we manage that? And so, oftentimes when, I met with the finance director, who was Sandy Pooler a while ago, and the new finance director is kind of, we talked about what's sustainable in terms of growth in Amherst. And so how do you match your level of services with what, revenue and income you're bringing in? And how do you manage that with, free cash and capital projects? And so, the town, John Musanti had proposed a few number of years ago, actually 5 capital projects for $100 million when, borrowing was less than 1%. And it was a lot for the community and it didn't move forward. But now, we're paying over $100 million for an elementary school. And so, hindsight's 2020, but, I think people understood that it was a lot of money. I don't think they realized how much it was going to cost in the future from that perspective. And so, like I said, he was conservative, but when there was an idea and it was time to move it forward, he would try to really work with that.
What's your experience relative to financial forecasting, and reviewing financial policies? How would you go about doing that here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will say my role is limited. Previously I worked as a mutual fund accountant. I worked at State Street Bank in Boston. I managed, hundreds of millions of dollars. I was, essentially, their checkbook. And so in that, I worked with a lot of international funds. And so most of it was day to day. A lot of it was, maybe week to week forecasting, what do you buy given the stock market? Foreign markets would lag. So, if the market closed high, how do you and where do you invest in money? On the fiscal side with the town, I haven't been too involved with the forecasting. Looking at budgets, I see, where do you keep services? What are the core services? What's required by bylaw and statute? What's something else you could manage if it's more discretionary? But really trying to manage what's that kind of growth factor that each community can keep expanding and operating within.
Okay, Nate, the candidates were asked to do a presentation to the board. Let me just explain some background on it for the public. So you were asked to assume that you're the current town administrator and the powers to be have determined that a levy limit override is necessary. Again, this is a scenario that I was asked to develop. So it's not a decision, made by the town. So the levy limit override will be needed to balance the budget to maintain a current service levels to schools and general government. So you've been asked to make a presentation as to the options for the town to proceed with the $800,000 levy limit override and a recommendation for a plan for the town to present and communicate this request to the citizens.
Sure.
So I'll turn it over to you to talk.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I provided a handout. It's essentially 4 pages, kind of like 8 slides. So my approach, I think, I'd use a budget team. I think you already have one in place, but I would, work on that. I think it's important to have a team. Like I said, you have talented staff here. I'd lean on them. Your finance treasurer. I'd acknowledge it's a difficult situation and Hadley's not alone. So if you look at the paper, Belchertown, Granby, a bunch of communities are looking at it. When I was online, Hudson actually has a $4 million override happening this year, Hudson, Mass. And so I think a lot of communities are facing that. Clear communication. So both with staff and the public, and use existing resources. So, there's department heads who know the community. There's Mass, the Division of Local Services and Department of Revenue. if I go through there, I think Hadley has a lot of highlights. So I think, the budget really, right, is prioritizing and implementing goals and community vision. So, I think there's a lot of things to be proud of in Hadley. And so how do you keep maintaining local services? How do you maintain agricultural lands and open space? And how does the budget make that work? And, make the community understand that. So, we have strong local schools. There's senior housing now, there's an overlay. And so, on the second page is then describing the budget position. So, as it was described, there's an $800,000 shortfall. And really explaining that, expenses are outpacing revenue. There's higher health insurance costs. There's, capitalization of the ambulance service. And then there's increase in wages and COLAs and other retirement, other planning. And then really, what's the Proposition 2.5 override? And look, I think the question for me would be, is it really enough? And so can $800,000 get the town to be financially stable, say in the next 5 years, where there's a plan to get into a better position? You want to maintain certain accounts, you want to have good bond rating. So I know, an override is not something taken lightly, but if you only want to do it once in a great while, is that enough really amount? So, in the budget, it looked like there was a 1.1 million. I know it's hypothetical here, but if you looked at what was actually, reduced, 1.15 million, is an $800,000 override enough? I know you can always come back and look at state aid and what's happening with, different revenue sources. But, I'd kind of ask that question. Moving forward, I'd actually, what are the options for the override? Having a detailed departmental budgets, really, what does it mean if the override doesn't happen? And so what, have line items showing what would be reduced, have a brief narrative, it could be bullet points. And so, what does that mean for different departments? And then, assemble the budget team again to look at, different scenarios. So what's required, what's working, what isn't, really, is it a percent reduction across the board, which doesn't seem necessarily equitable or fair? And is there, strategic savings in different departments? And so, what does that look like? Is it reductions in services? How do you prioritize that? So if the override didn't pass, right, and there actually was an $800,000 shortfall, what's the right approach? Is it reorganizing some departments? Is it combining positions? Is it a hiring freeze? And then, lastly, would it be a layoff? Do you try to maintain the staff you have, maybe combining staff, reducing hours, but allowing the employees to work? And then come up with a plan. I think considerations for now and the future. To me, it's planning in context. So not just getting to, next fiscal year. It's like, what about the next 3 fiscal years? So how do you forecast out? What are, revise the capital improvement plan? Explore health insurance options. Is there a health insurance plan that maybe employees would be willing to take? Maybe a higher deductible plan that could save the town money? Is there different routes to go there? And then, I think there's different articles that I've read in the paper, right? So the state pilot for preserved lands, I think is interesting. What are some legislative actions at the state level that could help? Can you work with the strategic partnership agreement with UMass? The payment from UMass seems pretty small to Hadley, in my opinion. And so, how do you manage that? Zoning and land use provide opportunities for development. And so it may not happen right away, but that's why I'm saying if you plan for 5 years, new growth happens, and then maybe the budget is balanced again. The local meals tax, there's some things in the Empowerment Act that may pass. I think that would be really helpful for Hadley. And then the public campaign, I think, make use of websites. So Belchertown had a webpage dedicated to Proposition 2.5, Hudson did. And so, Amherst did back in 2007, I think it was they had a 30-page report. It was lengthy. It was very informative, but I think having charts and graphs explaining what are the possible cuts, what does it really mean to have a Proposition 2.5 override in terms of impact on property taxes? It's adding to the base and then that's taxed again at 2.5%. So, given the different values of homes in Hadley, what really is the impact on an annual basis in terms of the override? And, going back to then the highlights of Hadley, is this what we would need or want as a small town? So we have high level services, good schools. An override was never meant to be kind of a threshold that becomes a penalty, right? It's actually a threshold at which then the community decides on itself if they want to tax themselves more for the services in the community they have. And so I'd really want to communicate that, right? Hadley may be a small town, but you have great services, you have UMass, you have a big daytime population. And I know it's not all on Hadley to bear, but you've had new positions. You have the land use coordinator, right? Fire and ambulance is happening. HR there's a lot to happen in HR. And so do we want to fund those departments and positions? And it might actually need, an override and different tax structure in the future. So, multimedia approach, really explaining Proposition 2.5 and, make sure the community understands the process. And so I think there'd be a lot of people upset if there's an override, but I think if you can be clear and effective in your communication, at least they'll understand it and what's at stake and why it's important. And so again, I think unfortunately it's become a dirty word and it seems like it's a penalty, but it's an opportunity to me to, fund what's important to the community. And then it's a time to reflect and say, how can we move forward with a new budget plan? How do we move Hadley forward in terms of new growth and development? And, really what are our limits and constraints moving forward?
What's been your involvement with projects, implementation or, budgeting and creating?
Sure. Yeah. So, I said I applied for a lot of grants. So I've worked a lot with, most of the recreation improvements in Amherst. So Groff Park, Kendrick Park and the town center, the town common. I managed the block grant. So, in the last 15 years, I managed, $20 million in federal money and block grant money. That's everything from water and sewer infrastructure to road paving, affordable housing projects. And so usually, there's a team of staff, interdepartmental team, whether it's assistant town manager, public works, conservation planning. And so, we work together to apply for those. And then typically, I manage those. So whether it's compliance reporting, closing out the grant, making sure the project is happening, attending weekly meetings, I'll defer to engineering and public works when necessary, right? But, being there and knowing, what are the parameters of the grant program and the project and how do we keep it going? And so, typically I'm a part of the application process and part of the team that meets weekly or monthly with contractors and part of the closeout.
So let's move over to HR.
Sure.
A large part of this job, of course, is working with employees and HR and so on. Talk about your experience, what level that is, in Amherst and what you've done there, and how does that translate to becoming a town administrator here?
Sure. Yeah. So I've helped the town update its personnel procedures and manual twice now. So it was done a number of years ago and more recently with HR. And so, that's, wage scales, overtime, just employee benefits, all of that. So, how do you maintain a good policy document in terms of employee morale? And, I've been on the hiring team for, almost 10 positions and department heads. I've onboarded a number of new employees for the last 7 years. And so, bringing on new employees, referring them to the bylaw, personnel manual, and then just training them in terms of the planning department staff. And so, I think, HR is playing a more critical role, especially with, health insurance costs, with work-life balance, professional development. I think HR is really important. I think having good policy guidance and documents is really important. And so, you fall back on those documents when it's necessary, whether it's, a grievance procedure or it's an employee understanding their overtime or, how they can collect, flex time, how does that work? And so, that's part of, when we looked at the manual, we looked at all that. So, in Amherst, there's a number of unions, there's non-union employees. And so the manual guides non-union employees. If the union is silent, then it's the personnel manual. And so, for instance, we offer a shopping holiday. We describe overtime pay or, town hall closure, what happens then. And so it's in that manual. And so we discuss that, as part of a team and how to implement it.
So collective bargaining is a big part, of a town administrative position. Talk about how you would, transfer into that type of role. So, what steps would you take to move forward handling collective bargaining?
Sure. Yeah. I have limited experience with direct collective bargaining. I'd say that, working with change orders on projects is not the same, but, there can be some contentious issues there. I would do my research. I'd listen. You can see agreements online through MMA or even towns post them. What are the unions want? Like I said, there's a fiscal impact to contracts. And so really, how do you work within the projections of Hadley? And so, how do you make that feasible for all the different unions and contracts? Like I said, I'd listen. I think, I'd have a team with me to help guide me, whether it's HR, an attorney or part of the finance team. And, and understand, can both sides come to an agreement and keep things moving forward. So I think, everyone would want to work for the town of Hadley and want to be in the position they're in. I think it comes down to what are the policies in terms of, pay scale, compensation, overtime, and if there's an issue, it goes back to those documents. So making sure those are clear and understandable.
What are some of the key issues that have to be addressed in HR today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the health insurance is one, Amherst is facing it. I know Hadley is as well. So how do you maintain, health insurance? I think employee morale and support. I think, it's more about, I say work-life balance, but it's also beyond the health insurance. How do you, employees are supported and, and engaged. So both, as a, from their leadership and also from HR. And so how can they rely on HR and use them as, as a resource? So it's not just go to HR when there's a problem, but, are there employee assistance programs or just different programs? So we've, in town hall, we have, yoga, we do, healthy snack baskets. We apply for grants through HR to get that. And so some of it's the small things that help with, staff and morale. I think professional development is really important. And so keeping, the wages up to date, I know there's a classification study happening. Amherst has done it periodically, but, helping people understand where they are, how they can move up in an organization. How can you empower them to feel like they, they're supported and they want to stay in that organization, I think is really important.
Maybe you can send over the guidelines on a healthy snack basket.
I was thinking the same thing.
Sorry, I had to toss that in.
There's in there.
Yeah. Well, when hiring somebody, what are the 3 important qualities you see when hiring an employee?
Sure. Yeah, I think as a public sector employee, I'd want to know that they're engaged and interested in actually, public service. And so, when we've looked for a planner position recently, we have students from architecture and public policy, but especially the architecture students or even environmental design, they love the design aspect. So they apply thinking they're going to be designing projects, not really realizing that they're interfacing with the public, and a lot of it's regulatory review in the planning world and it's project management. So, it's not this it's not like you're going to design this great park and have, great flower beds. It's going to be, how do you manage a team? And so to me, it's an eagerness to, kind of work in that role. I think having adaptability. And so, you come in with a skill set, and how do you grow and learn? Are you I think it goes back to the eagerness and willingness to learn. And so, I'd been in the town for a bit. My position was eliminated. I was told, but fortunately it was all grant funded. So I could work my way and keep my position, but it wouldn't be on the books for that year. And so I applied for a lot of grants. I managed a lot of grants that year, and I adapted. And, I like what I do. And so I like working for a town. I like working with people. I like, being a planner. And so I want to see that they also have that interest. And so I think honesty and integrity is really important. And so, can they fulfill the jobs they say they're going to do? Do they take the work seriously and can, if they need to, take work home? And so I treat my job as a private job. Unfortunately, I know it's a public sector role, but we used to joke around that it's like a private sector role, right? So I will work as hard as I can to get it done. And so if that means working in the evenings, checking my email, I do that. And so I don't necessarily expect everyone to do that, but I think when I'm hiring someone, I want to know that they have that kind of earnestness and that willingness to kind of put themselves, put their best foot forward and really put themselves into the position.
How do you deal with an employee who's not a team player?
Yeah, I think that could be difficult. And so some of it would be, what are the communication preferences? And so, they might not like you personally, but maybe professionally you can get along. And that can be hard, but it can be fine. And so, do they respond better to emails? Do you have one-on-one meetings? At some point, do you need to bring HR into the conversation and have some kind of mediation? But, before that, is there a way to kind of get past an impasse? Is it just a communication preference or a style? And so, there's times when I would rely on email more now than face-to-face because some employees might like that better. And then honestly, you can outline things. It's, you have to realize you have to have clear communication. Things could be misunderstood in a conversation, but through email, you can have bullet points and be clear on what you expect and what the role is, and really understand what their perspective is. And so is it a lack of interest? Is it, things that they don't understand? How can you support that employee and let them know that they can, take chances and grow? I'd want my employees to have opinions and use them. If we're hiring professional staff, I think, for instance, in my position, you can facilitate boards and committees, but, we all have degrees. I'd like people to use their degrees and have opinions. And I think that's important. And, I've been told sometimes I'm a little vocal at meetings, and I'm not trying to tell the board what to do, but if someone asks my opinion and I don't like something, I'll say it because I think that's important. That's why you hired me, right? I'm a professional planner or professional, role. And so I think I'd want to make sure employees feel that way. And so, how can we empower them to feel comfortable?
The next topic would be economic development, and a little bit,
Sure.
being next door. And I would say that's probably a strength of yours.
Right.
Why would that be a strength, and how would that be beneficial to Hadley?
Sure. Yeah. I think economic development probably means different things moving forward. I think housing is economic development. I think we have to consider what does brick and mortar mean, and what is online shopping? And, there was a UMass studio, right, that looked at the mall. I think the idea of having, student housing near, the university is economic development. I think promoting farmland and having wayfinding and cultural tourism is economic development. So I think there's, many different approaches. I think it's opportunities and regulations for growth. So what kind of zoning is there to allow for both, businesses and your traditional economic development or new development? There's Venture Way, there's possibilities of partnering with UMass or different organizations. How do you make that work? So, in Amherst, there was, a small kind of startup business, and they were looking for new space, and we didn't have it. And they moved, out of town, Zulu Pods. But, so is it that, Amherst and Hadley, could we be incubator space? Is it appropriate to have smaller sized businesses that can get root here, stay here, and maybe we can find places for them to grow? But how do you, work with UMass and have spinoffs here? Or how do you have smaller businesses and, have your regulations allow easier permitting for that? And so I think there's probably a lot of things that could be done, both along the commercial corridor and the rest of Hadley.
Let's talk a little bit about communications, and both internal and external. That's always the main topic, of discussion, in this day and age. How would you communicate with the citizens? How do you let the citizens know what the board's seeking or what the community is looking for?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I heard someone, mention, having the Rolodex of emails. I think that's good. I think Hadley's website is really important. I think it can be a repository of information. You can have, the ability to subscribe, say, to meetings or when agenda is posted. I would actually put a little bit of onus on the citizens. I think having a newsletter is important. I think using the website is important. Having office hours, going through the schools. And so, often now we've been using the schools as more of a resource when we have events to publicize. I think that's really important to engage through the school, different avenues. I think things in print are important. If there's friends groups, having them also report out using your boards and committees is important. And so it's not just the agendas and the minutes, but, is there a way to synthesize and summarize some of that information into quarterly newsletters or things online? I think that's really important. I know, it's hard to take the time. And so in Deerfield, I've been asked to join the planning board, finance committee, school committee, and unfortunately I declined because of my, I usually have 1 or 2 night meetings a week now. And then I coach sports and with my kids, right? So I don't feel good about volunteering knowing I wouldn't put the time in. And then I realized how hard it is to stay, even in the town I live in. And so I get electronic newsletters, I go to town hall, I look at documents. And so some of it would be, where can we have documents available for individuals? Is there different places? The library, the senior center here is probably more welcoming than, say, typically traditionally a town hall. And so, having things in print, I think having multimedia approach, I think office hours outside of town hall, like I said, having like the cup of Joe in the community is really important. And that could be with different department heads, the town administrator, select board members, or finance committee members, and just getting to hear from the community in a different venue and format than a traditional meeting.
Having to deal with conflicts and disputes comes with the position. How do you address that? How have you handled a polarizing issue, that's occurred in the community in the past?
Sure. Yeah. I think, right, internally, you hope you have good HR policies to deal with staff. I think externally, sometimes you have to, hit the pause button on, like I said, kind of clear communication and education. And so, recently we proposed an overlay on University Drive in town to densify housing with 6-story development. It'll probably be mostly students. It's considered market rate, multi-unit development. And some people really didn't like that idea. Some of it was understanding their position and then describing why it is important for the town. You know, it's new growth, it's appropriate location, there's benefits, there could be some drawbacks. You know, but what we found is that, you know, in that instance, most of the ambulance calls and police calls are not to the well-managed multi-unit developments. You know, it's actually the seniors, right, who have had the most calls to say for ambulances, and that's fine. But, you know, if someone thinks it's because there's, you know, a 6-story building, we find that those are really well managed. You know, the rents are too high, the management is too good to have problems there. And so it's sometimes the single family homes. And so it's really being adaptable, and how do you respond to some of those concerns and those disputes? You know, I think we'll have some more of those. We're looking at, and Amherst looking at the, you know, density in the general residence district. And so how do you allow infill but still maintain community character? I think that's really important. And so is it really the idea of having bigger houses, or say having 3 units on a property that may be the same size as a you know, bigger house? Or is it really the relationship of what that means to the community? Is it that those are student rentals and they're not invested in the community? And so is it really about the form and the density and the shape of the project, or is there some underlying concern? Is it the traffic? So, you know, some of it's understanding those positions and coming up with creative solutions. And it might be that you don't have a great answer at first and you have to hit pause.
I just want to pause and see if the board has questions, you know, of me at this point.
So one question I have for you is, I know your town manager might disagree, but from Hadley's perspective, Amherst has a lot of staff. Right, relative to what we have. So I'm just wondering about, you know, I can't remember, you said there, how many people in the planning department alone?
With administrative support, there's up to 7.
Yeah. So you'd be coming from a department of that size with one broad sweeping but singular function into a town where people are wearing so many different hats. One person's out, the office may have to close because there's nobody to backfill it. From a delegation standpoint, as a town administrator, you know, you heard Mike say, I mean, you come walking in with your, you know, your to-do list from Sunday night,
right,
and Monday is completely out the window.
Sure.
And there's a lot of frustration because things that you want to do, you may not be able to get done because you don't have the staff to do it. So, I mean, have you thought about that transition?
I have, yeah. So when I started, I was a graduate student intern. I was working on the Amherst master plan at the time, and we didn't have a procurement officer, so I actually managed all the procurement for grants and projects with the accountant and comptroller. And now we have a procurement officer, so I'm doing that less. But I was doing the newspaper advertisements, the bid postings, all the project management. I've staffed numerous boards and committees, and so that's oftentimes, although we have staff, and a lot of boards and committees, staff does a lot of the work, whether it's compiling applications for completeness, development application reports, drafting findings and conditions, making sure everything gets filed correctly, and working with applicants. And so, I feel like, if I have to do from, nuts and bolts and, work on the ground all the way up, I can do that. So to me, that's not a concern in terms of, how that works. And so, only recently has the planning department really expanded. So when I first started, it was a department of 3. And, like I said, we did a lot more in terms of different projects or roles and responsibilities. And it's since changed, but I feel like at one point it was, I was applying for, water quality grants and, things for wastewater treatment plants in terms of energy efficiency, new equipment and, working with facilities. And so I've kind of, had an experience with all of that.
Are you able to think on the fly? And then when this situation that we're talking about happens where Sunday night's plan doesn't work on Monday morning, do you get frustrated if you have to rethink your whole day, week, month, whatever?
No, I mean, that happens all the time as well. So I have, a long to-do list. There's there's things that are, immediate in nature that need to be responded to, and things that can take time, that have a longer planning horizon. And so, I feel like I'm a utility player in town. So although in the planning department, I often work with different departments on projects, whether it's, culvert replacements or different grants, new water and sewer lines using block grant money. And so, if, that recently happened in town and the engineer said, we have a change order because it's, there's high groundwater, do we have money in place to do that for pumping? And, it's a mess down here. So what do we do? And, I don't have the answers, but I could find the money and say, yeah, we can provide a change order to get the equipment down there that day. And so I don't get frustrated by that. I think that's just part of the job. That's part of the role. And so, I've had to drive grant applications into Boston. I ran after the FedEx truck to deliver them. And, that's just all part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other board members? So at this point, talk about your relationship. You work for several boards now, I have worked for several boards. What's the relationship look like between you and the board? And in this case, would be the select board moving forward and have.
Sure. Yeah. I'd like to know, everyone individually, personally and also professionally, work with the chair to understand, how to, run meetings and how I can help facilitate. Like I said, the mission statement of the select board is good. There's plans in town. So how do I facilitate those plans? How do I work with the select board in terms of the vision of the community? So whether that's, applying for grants or working with department heads on budgeting, different projects, community events, how do I work with the select board on that? And so like I said, I don't think we have to agree on everything, but I'd like to think we can have a good relationship, professionally and personally.
So you've been appointed by the town. It's 1 year later. What do you think you would want your accomplishments to be, in 1 year? I'm not talking project based, I'm talking leadership based.
Yeah. I'd like to think that the town employees feel supported and that they like coming to work every day. And so, to me, it's important that they do feel like they're valued and that, they feel like they're making a difference in the community. And so, I think as a public employee, sometimes you do this for the satisfaction of working with the community. Maybe it's for different benefits. And, I'd want the community to know that, we're there for them and the employees to know that we're there for them. And so, I think having, both for the employees and also for the community, I think it'd be important for the community to know that we're listening and we're attentive. And I think, after a year, it'd be nice to think that we're on a track to have a good relationship.
Okay, great. Last call for the board. Any additional questions from the board?
Hearing none.
Okay, so Mike. You okay if I? Mike's got his hand raised.
You okay if I ask?
Sure.
You mentioned that you have a quiet leadership style.
Sure.
One of the answers to one of your questions. Can you describe what that means? And kind of describe what your leadership style is?
Yeah, I think by that I would mean I'd want to listen first. And I like doing the research. I like reading plans and reports and understanding positions and, as opposed to being kind of brash and throwing ideas out there without knowing the consequences. And so I think that's kind of more of my style. So I like to get to know people informally and I'd like to have one-on-ones as well. But, I like face-to-face time. So, with my new employees, I walk over there a few times a day. We have Zoom meetings, even though we're in the office, so we can go over training material or, online things. And I like that. And I also like then having more formal meetings, but really it's, kind of getting to know employees and goals and visions and plans for the town and then figuring out how to move those forward, but not jumping right in and pushing things that, I might not know a lot about. And so that's kind of the style I take.
So that concludes the formal interview. So Nate, this is an opportunity for you to give a closing statement to the select board.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for sitting with me this evening. And I know it's been a long evening. Like I said, I'm from the area. I plan to stay here. And so I'm not, if I worked in Hadley, I've been in Amherst for 17 years and honestly, I'd like to stay in a community as long as I can. And so I'd grow and adapt with you and with Hadley and I'd really put myself into a position. And so I invest in it. And so I wouldn't be looking in 5 years and I'd want to, make sure that I'm working with the select board and, I'd have, contract renewals and it'd be great to say, someone's been here for a long time. I don't get complacent, so it's not that I'm complacent in Amherst. I think my role has been changing. I'm still excited to come in every day and there's different projects and I keep learning. And so, I think that's really important and I'd give the same to Hadley. And so, but I don't want to spend my time doing something if I'm not interested. And so, like I said, I took it seriously to apply to this position and, I'd have to work and learn if I was chosen and I'd really put myself, in this position. So thanks.
Great. So thank you very much. Again, we appreciate you coming here this evening and talking to the select board. And they will now be having a discussion as to whether they make a decision tonight or tomorrow. You'll be hearing back from me, as to status.
Sure.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nate.
Yeah.
So what are you doing on Amity Street?
So on University Drive and Henry Street, there'll be another roundabout. And so it's actually, the level of service for the intersection's been increasing over the years, and so we're actually having a single roundabout shifted off the intersection. And hopefully it'll slow traffic. As far as UMass wanted that too, so we applied for a massive grant, combination with development on a corner there, such that $2 million grant to implement the roundabout and traffic calming maintenance. And it's also, getting rid of university from there. So they're then planning more traffic calming in front of the stadium. So it's kind of, but it's happening there now. It's water and sewer work. Then roundabout, and then new utility lines.
And how long will the roads be closed?
Raptors.
So actually, the road won't be closed. It'll be reduced level of service, but the roundabout station is gonna be off the intersection, so you still be able to navigate the intersection. And then, in the course of the week, it'll go from being a four-way intersection to a roundabout.
Cool.
Thank you.
Want an interview and Amherst.
Yeah, there you go.
Let's say.
Public service
It
announcement.
affects Hadley. Everybody's saying, what are they doing? I can't go that way.
Taking you see it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is all our discussion in open session?
Yes. Yes, it is. I am not familiar with this process, so what do we do next?
So, I mean, I'll let John tell you what he's seen in the past, but you can either discuss the candidates right now if you'd like, or you can simply discuss whether, since it has been a long day, you can discuss whether or not you would prefer to sleep on it and then have your discussion and potential decision tomorrow.
I'm happy to decide today.
I
Do
would,
you have any other words of wisdom for us?
No, so this is, you've had, three candidates before you, and again, as
Yeah.
Mike said, this is your choice. Some boards are ready for a decision after the interview, some boards wish to, have a night to think about it.
Mhm.
So it's up to you. The only thing I ask at this point, when you do discuss the candidates, that, I want to thank the three candidates for putting themselves out there. It's a very difficult thing, having been in that seat. It's not easy going into another community and putting yourself out there. When you have your discussion, talk about the positive traits, of the candidates, which one is the best fit, for the town of Hadley moving forward. So just ask you to, keep it to a positive discussion, about the candidates, on that aspect. So at this point, it's up to you whether you're ready to make a decision this evening. When you do make a decision, it may be a split vote of the board. If that's the case, I would ask you consider you have a second vote, showing full support of the board, afterwards, in case it's a 4-1-3-2 vote, that a second vote be considered. It's your choice, for a 5-0 affirmation, of a person moving forward. And then basically the board needs to make a determination, if you have a candidate at that point, who is going to handle the contract, at this point. So you should set up a your negotiating team, because as noted earlier, this is a negotiation is the final step, to go forward with whoever you do select. So those are the choices before the board. I'm here to assist in, with any questions you may have, but the discussion, is for the board to have.
Okay. What's the pleasure of the board? Do we want to discuss?
I would like to discuss tonight.
I would as well. I already know who I would like personally.
Okay,
Um,
so do we go down the line and talk about the individual candidates?
I think, yeah, I mean, sometimes I think it's good to get everybody's perspective on, as you're saying, not, I don't want to say the cons, but the strengths and, who's stronger in which particular areas. So I'd be interested in hearing everybody's, I'll, in my head right now, it's not obvious. So I'll just say that.
So I actually had the pleasure of being part of the screening committee and going through the first round of interviews, and then tonight getting to see them again. And I could definitely see some growth from from the first interviews to now. And the one thing that I was really thinking about, going through this process was, let's just say whoever we hire, we're 1 week in, Mike gets hit by a bus and, Lauren is also in some tragic
Right.
situation. I know, I hate to put it like that, but
I get the bus.
but that's
Driving them up.
no, I do, but that's just what I'm thinking about is, okay, so something tragic happens, who did we interview of the 3 people that would be able to still chug along without a lot of hand holding? And that's kind of where my mind was, because any one of these candidates could be very successful here, but my brain is, I know that Mike wants to get back to his job. And which of these 3 candidates would give us the shortest amount of, transition time for you? And for me, it was somebody who already is doing the job, just on a smaller scale. And I appreciated all of the concrete examples that he had and the knowledge of the full scope of the job. So that's, for me, that's where I'm at.
Don't be afraid to throw a name out.
Oh, sorry. I really liked Nick Kakamo. I think that he was, in my opinion, going to be the most successful with where he's at right now in his career.
Jane?
I agree, and I was also on the search committee, and I think that the presentation that Nick made tonight was a better selling of himself, perhaps. And I have more confidence, but I still hesitate about whether any of these 3 candidates would be able to step into the job and hit the floor running, because it will be hit the floor running.
Mhm. Okay. I'll go next. I liked some of Nick's experience, even though it's only a year and a half. Or 4, whatever it is.
I think it's 4.
4, okay. So he's got the most experience in the position. I didn't, and I'm gonna be a little negative, John, but not too badly. I did not appreciate Alex's presentation in that he was more, to me, more concerned with how to interact with the community members than with the board and the town hall. And Nate, although he doesn't have the town administrator experience, I really like his planning experience and his ideas for potentially building up our revenue base. So I'm not sold on any one person right now, either.
I actually have to agree with you on Nate as well. Like, I thought he's a very, for me, close second.
Wow.
So similar. I really liked, I think that Nick definitely has a stronger financial background. I think that was very, very clear. And part of what prompted me to ask Nate the question I did about, are you going to be able to roll up your sleeves and just do it? Because that's what it takes here. So I definitely appreciated that about Nick, and the fact that he gets it. There definitely it's a huge difference between Williamsburg and Hadley. And, I'm not sure that he would be able to step in without some level of what do you call that person in the, somebody flying, a little bit of cover? Is that what you call it?
Hand holding.
Yeah. So, you know, flying cover for a bit, similar to what we did with Carolyn, however, we might want to make that work. As Randy said, the thing I really like about, and so Nate, I think he strikes me as somebody who's very, who's going to pick up on things very quickly. So I guess I question whether he could come up to speed on the financial side. I do like, what I wrote was, you know, really kind of a broad town-wide perspective. I have a feeling that Nate would likely want to start getting some things done. I just sensed a little bit more drive there. Not that that's good or bad. I also think that he would need some help. I don't think it's obvious that he could do the job, like stepping into it. Alex, I very much enjoyed his personality. I can totally see him rocking in the job that he's in now. I just think from a practical standpoint, ultimately, I'm sure he probably could be a really good town administrator, but I just don't think, I think there's too much of a learning curve for Alex to give us what we need right now. So I'm doing the two different shoulder thing.
David.
My turn. All right. So for me, it's between Nick and Nathaniel. I thought Alexander, like you said, I think he's probably great in what he does now. I don't think it's a good fit for Hadley and our needs right now. So between Nick and Nathaniel, Nick's obviously has the town administrator experience. Similar to what Molly said, I don't think it scales as easily as he thinks it does to Hadley. I also have some concerns that we'd be a very short-term stepping stone once he realizes the complexity of Hadley's issues going forward. As far as Nathaniel, although he doesn't have the town administrator experience, he strikes me as a pretty smart person that has a lot of the experience for grants and project management and things like that we need as a town. At the same time, I don't know that Amherst experience is a good fit for Hadley necessarily with what we're looking for in town. So at the end of the day, I'm not 100% in love with any of the three. But for me, it's between Nick and Nathaniel. So
the other thing with that Nate did say was that he, you know, was here for longevity, and that's, you know, I think we'd be okay if we were, you know, back in this and, you know, looking in like 7 years, maybe 5, but like. Definitely not in the next couple of years, because I think there's been a lot of change in our town pretty recently. There's, you know, between new buildings and expenditures and turnover, that I really want to see something that's consistent for a while. But again, there's no guarantees with anyone that we hire.
So what do we think about, I mean, I guess are we between 2 or are we between 3? Like, can we narrow it down tonight?
Can we narrow it down to the 2?
I think we can narrow it down to the 2. You agree with that, Jane?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and can I, Amy just put a thought in my head. I do think we have some sensitivity, and so I want to be careful because some part of this goes into like contract language, but I think we do have some sensitivity, at least I have some sensitivity to commuting. So I don't have a sense, I mean, Nate was very free about his location. When Nick was talking, he said something about a long commute to Williamsburg, and I picked up on that. So is that something we need to defer?
It's not,
He's in,
it's not on his resume?
he lives in Pittsfield.
He lives in Pittsfield.
He lives, yeah, but I mean, sometimes people go, I didn't see anything in the cover letter.
So he's done the commute from Pittsfield to,
Okay,
next door,
Next door is
at least
still
it says-
25 minutes,
yeah, it's an extra 20 minutes. That's,
depending on the hour.
yeah,
But that's, I mean, I commuted
Yeah.
in my position, I was in Burlington.
Yeah, I've done
And
it
with an
too.
hour ride, and that's personal, type
Sure.
thing.
Yep.
As long as the person's committing to being I never missed a town event.
Mhm.
I had an understanding what my wife, what we're going to, what we weren't, but I think that's a discussion you have. As part, as making sure that they're committed to the community, not just Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, but town administrator needs to be a leader, as part of community events. You talked about, your festivities over this past weekend, being available. So I think that's a discussion you have, as part of that. But most administrators are commuting to some extent, so.
Hold on, I'm just thinking of something. Just wanted a point of clarity. Did Nick say that he was also currently interviewing with other? Or was that Alex? Which one? Nick did say that, because he said that, I believe he said that there were interviews.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's relevant, but
Well, everything can be relevant. It doesn't.
well, I mean, no, I'm just thinking, like, I think he was saying, one of us asked a question and he was saying something about some towns like this and some towns don't, but I'm still interviewing. Anyway,
Mhm.
okay,
To me, it sounded like he had been on quite a lot of town administrator interviews recently.
Yeah.
That's what I gathered from that.
I'm not aware of any, but
Okay.
it's not happening,
Yeah.
but,
no, I was thinking about that and
Mr. Chief Administrator, do you have any thoughts?
No,
But we're paying you to have thoughts.
no,
I miss you.
I'm fine with you narrowing it down. I'm fine with the two candidates that you've selected to narrow it down to. I'm thinking, all the points that were made here tonight are nothing that I can't make happen. I know that you're concerned even with those two candidates that they're not going to be able to hit the ground running, but as John has mentioned multiple times, nobody's born a town administrator, so everybody has to have their first job at some point. So I think what you would need to do is select the one that you think can work, with me and with you until you're satisfied that they are where they need to be.
Mhm.
And the only other thing that I am thinking about is just, one of the points that was brought up, or one of the questions maybe that I think that one of the select board asked about Nick was, where are you at if you were to leave Williamsburg? What do you think, how do you think they would handle it, type of thing? And I'm not sure the meaning behind the question. I think it was more morale-based question, but where my mind went was, when can you leave? And, what position will you be leaving them in? And so for me, when I think about someone who's doing this job, there are certain parts of the year, and I think John and I have had this conversation before, where they're not going to be able to leave. They're not going to leave a town in the lurch in, budget times and things like that. And I don't necessarily think that should be looked at as a negative, so to speak. I think that kind of speaks to some loyalty aspects there. But at the same time, there'll be a delay, if he's the person that you choose. And if Nate is a integral part of the planning process over in Amherst, you may end up running into the same situation over there where he's not willing to walk away from projects that he's currently doing. But I'm fine with the two candidates that you have selected to mull over and think about. And I'm missing a baseball game tonight. And so tomorrow night, while you're making this decision, I won't be here. I'll be coaching a game because I got 2 in a row or 3 in a row. So those are my thoughts for tomorrow.
What were you just saying about loyalty?
He's got his royalties lined up there.
No, I fully appreciate that, Mike. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
So what do we think about doing a less structured interview of the 2 candidates that'll come up with some ideas to talk about? Because I think, these are all kind of theoretical, broad questions that gives us a basis of their personality and how they are, but I think we could come up with some more Hadley specific questions and maybe.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's, you pick Nick, you pick Nate. Or none, neither.
Yeah.
And I don't feel strongly enough.
Right.
That, I mean.
What I will
make a
say though,
decision tonight.
from being part of the first round of interviews and from, being here tonight, I will say that Nick blossomed from his first interview. And I feel like Nate was consistent. So those are both positive things.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Well,
take that how you will.
I agree with what David said though, because during this whole process, I'm thinking, all right, how does that happen in this town? Generally speaking, yes, but we have Hadley specific situations where, come Monday morning, you got 20 people coming at you at once. How do you deal with that?
Right.
Or any number of things that can happen. You get a letter from an attorney complaining that they have a problem in front of their house. Yeah. So, how do you deal with that stuff? I think it would be nice to be able to ask those kinds of questions.
And I think personally, if I had to make a decision tomorrow night, it would be none of them because I don't feel that I know enough.
That's my worry too.
So
I don't want to make the wrong decision.
Right. I want
So
a chance to.
one of the things, because I was on the previous search committee, the town administrator, I was surprised that in these interviews, none of the people had done what I would call their homework, or they had only done superficial things. Nobody had watched a select board meeting that I heard of. Nobody had reviewed any of our documents.
From these candidates?
I did hear one of them looking at our budget, but I didn't hear a lot of other things. As we did in the first interview, and David, you were on that, they had done their homework. It was like, oh, they know more about this town than most of our citizens.
I did hear him talk about the master plan and some of the other things. But I think the problem is a lot of these questions were very broad. So they couldn't say, well, on page 20 of the master plan, it says you're supposed to have this. So I think a chance for us to ask more questions about things like that would be beneficial.
So, John, sorry.
I was just gonna say, it doesn't sound like you'd be ready. Would you be ready to do that 24 hours from now?
That's what I mean.
All right.
You've done this many times, but based on what we're saying, do you have an opinion on us scheduling a second interview?
We can do that. Okay. I guess I'm trying to understand maybe what should occur is, I'm going to say, I've not had this situation before, usually boards are ready, at this point. And, so maybe one-on-ones, we could arrange something, with you each meeting with, each of the 2 candidates, to talk to. I'm not sure how we, develop, we can develop more questions, but I'm not sure, in a format like this, whether it's going to get to particular pieces. The number one issue to me is leadership. I always say that, to the board, which of these candidates, because learning, getting into the budget, you've got a very good finance person. You got Mike who would still be here as, he was the interim. He understands this stuff. Some of this stuff is, can be learned fairly quickly. Budgeting is, I think all 3 of these people have the capacity to dive into the budget and, master that, within the year. I'm not worried about that. The HR, you've got an HR director, that can work with that. The biggest skill is which of these people can best lead your organization and pull that together. Did you get a sense of that tonight, in these interviews? As to which of these people do you think you could trust, that your people would trust, coming into it. So, I think that's the bigger discussion. Do you think it can get to that point? These were, in my opinion, three good candidates. I think the screening committee did a great job, in pulling this together, for the board for consideration. I'm not sure, going back out, again, community, there's a community out there who's doing their third search right now in the last 2 years, because they just can't, come to an agreement on the board. Every time you do another search, it doesn't necessarily mean you get different candidates or, better candidates.
So let me give you an example,
Yeah.
right? So using your example of leadership, right?
Yep.
So for Nick, from what I heard, he's got 4 years of experience under his belt in a leadership role,
Sure.
right? Clearly. We have to assume things are going well. Again, you did your background checking and things like that.
Well, and his contract got renewed.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
yeah.
So, I mean, we have reason to believe that, that's a good thing. But it's also, I lived in Williamsburg, so Williamsburg's a very small town.
Yep.
And it has, core families. I mean,
It's a different flavor.
Yeah.
but it's a very different flavor. And the issues that are in Williamsburg, having to exhibit leadership skills. I don't want to suggest in any way that it's easy. It's not
Yeah.
at all. So that's one context for leadership. Then you look at Nate, who doesn't have that kind of a more executive level leadership per se. But we are neighbors and we know what goes on in Amherst. So the leadership that needs to be exhibited to get projects through in Amherst requires a skill set, which can be very multifaceted and complex. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think that's why I'm saying, like, I feel like we need to ask more.
Well, and in keeping with what you just said, Molly, I think that Nick is going to be used to a very slow pace. And coming here, he's going to get overwhelmed. Whereas Nate is used to this kind of situation, not at the same level, but he's there's a bunch of staff. They got projects coming in at him from every direction. He's going to be used to dealing with the concern of, how do I deal with the fact that I have all these things that I didn't know were here yesterday, and now I got to deal with them.
And then the flip side of that, though, Nick is used to not having a lot of support and figuring things out himself, whereas Nate is used to having a lot of people, there to support him.
The other thing I see, and I think both of them have great possibilities, is that Nate would walk into this even less prepared than Carolyn did, and it took a while for her to get up and going. And I think our town is in a position right now that we need somebody who's up and going instead of someone who's in the training cycle.
I hear what you're saying, but we need somebody that's up and going that we feel like is going to be the
And it
right
may be
fit.
that neither of these characters,
That's correct.
candidates are the ones.
Yeah.
And that's my problem with if we rush this, because then if that was the case, my vote would be no on all three of them. Because I don't want to make the mistake of being stuck with somebody that's not the right fit for the town. So whether it takes another couple of weeks to come up with the questions or have another round or however we want to do it, I mean, we don't have to decide tonight, but.
No, and we may need to, again, think about kind of I'll call it a safety net. What's the safety net around either one of these candidates to have a game plan to make sure that they're positioned for success?
Right.
Which is
Right, we don't want to hire someone and have them fail.
correct. Absolutely. Like Amy said, we want them here for a while.
Mhm. Yes, we do. Okay, so.
John, can I ask you without naming any names, the community that's gone out 3 different times, are they doing anything differently by going out each time? Is anything changing, or are they just simply hoping for better candidates every time?
They've increased the pay a couple of times. They used us the first time. They did it without a consultant the second time. They're using a different consultant the third time. But the thing is, the board couldn't come to agreements. The board was split, over situations. And so the board couldn't come to an understanding of who to choose. The first time was only a 4-member board, and it ended up 2-2. As to a vote. And so, different type situations. But there's been a few communities that's gone back out. It happens. It doesn't happen often. There's one in this area, that's gone back out and trying again. But I think, you got to take a look at the candidates, and of course, I think you're down to 2 candidates here. I think both of them have capacity. For, the position here, you got to get comfortable with that. It's not for me to get comfortable with, but I think both these candidates, have, capacity. And I think, some of the questions, you pursued and we pursued tonight, I think addressed some of that, as to, how they would move forward with that. And, so I think when you look at, the bulk of their history on each of them, they're not youngsters in their first job, so I think they bring, 2 different type experiences to the table who've been doing it and, working, either, you've got one who was in the city, and then in a small town. Experienced it different ways, but worked in a school too, as a teacher. And, he talked about how he would bring, mentorship, to the table and so on. And then you got a candidate who lives in one of the tougher communities in the state, in different ways. I'm not saying it's not difficult here, in some aspects, but, he's been able to, do well in a community that expects certain, high level of expectations, from certain areas, as well as change of government and so on. So he's had to exist, from being a town to a city, in the change of format. But again, when I look at the number one piece of the leadership, yes, they've got some, learning skills. And, as Mike mentioned, one of my favorite phrases is, I wasn't born a town administrator. You come in and you got to find that you have some of the core skills. And to me, that's the leadership side. Do they have that? And I know, you got to get comfortable.
No, and no offense, I think you're selling us too hard on this because I think kind of universally, it seems like everybody kind of thought we need a little bit more information. So I don't think there's any doubt they have the capability to be a town administrator.
Sure.
It's just a matter of whether it is the capability to be our town administrator. And at least for me, I'm not comfortable making that decision anytime soon, and definitely not tomorrow night based on what we saw tonight. So,
and I'm recognizing that.
Yeah. So, and I get you're trying to promote the candidate and whatnot, but I just no used car sales. It's what it comes across.
I wasn't attempting to,
yeah,
and I'm sorry you heard it that way.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to get, at a point of being comfort, level here. And I understand that,
Yeah.
This is not my decision to make, going through, so.
So it sounds like we can postpone tomorrow night and
Schedule something.
in the next couple of
Possible.
weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
May I suggest, that you maybe meet tomorrow night to discuss what that can look like, versus holding this off, and I'm not talking about, making a decision. I'm talking about what does this process look like?
We can talk about that right now.
Right now,
Okay.
Yeah.
So your thoughts, Molly, you've got questions in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking again, I'd like some time to think. And then maybe each one of us comes up with a question, or we all come up with 2 questions or something, run them by John, so we don't get in hot water. I mean, that's very important. You know, you don't want us necessarily riffing, you know, with HR stuff. And again, and, you know, bring them back for just a second interview that hopefully would be no more than half an hour each, and then make a decision then. And I recognize one of the risks too is that if we don't decide, then are we sending a signal to both candidates that they're not good enough? But I'm hoping that they're hearing the struggle we're having right now.
Yeah.
Sure. And if they know anything about Hadley and they did do their homework, they're gonna know that it's legit.
So I would suggest then that we put this on the select board meeting next week from tomorrow as a discussion item to come with our questions and then present
What's
those.
the agenda looking like for next week?
It's not too bad.
Water sewer rate hearing.
Yeah, I mean, that's your biggest issue. The rest of the agenda is.
Okay, well, this should, let's do that, yes?
Well, do we want to send out the questions to John and Mike because if we do it at a meeting
Yeah,
together, then they see their questions in advance and.
It's true.
yeah.
Well, then we don't need to put it on the agenda. I was
Right.
just thinking we would avoid duplicating questions, but
Well,
Okay.
right,
I
but
mean-
David makes a good point.
So
Yeah,
wait,
I
you're
agree.
saying put it on the,
Well, that would be, we would have to have, if we put anything on the agenda, it's gonna have to be having them back
no,
to
but
ask the questions, because David's saying that if we discuss it next week, it's gonna be out in the public what the questions are. And I don't think we want that, do we?
oh, no, for sure. I'm just questioning whether we schedule another meeting and not wait until Wednesday.
but again, if we have the meeting and we're discussing the questions, or are we gonna interview at that
No,
point?
no, I thought we were saying we come up with questions, send them to John.
Right.
And John says, okay, here are the 5 you get to ask or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you put it in your words based on,
And you think that that will happen within, and that we should then have that meeting a week from tonight? Is that what I'm hearing?
yeah, I mean,
But what is that meeting going to entail?
the actual interview.
Okay. Okay, so
Y'all want to do it before your meeting? Do you want to meet early again?
can that work, John? Hang on just a minute, Jennifer, sorry. Will that give you enough time to get questions if we get them
So
to
you're
you
talking about
by?
bringing in the candidates next Wednesday?
Yes,
A week
Okay,
from-
At like 5 o'clock or something. Or
That's what I was asking, yeah.
That's fine.
I can-
I'm not available. I have another set of interviews, scheduled
okay,
for Wednesday next week.
But if you did the question,
But if I did the questions, you could come in and have the discussion.
and
That's
then
fine.
Lauren could be there, so Lauren could like give us the.
Stop.
You've gone too far.
What time's the rate hearing?
6 PM and that's publicized. That's a public hearing, so it has to happen at 6.
I may become a bit, I'll know next week whether I would be available Wednesday night or not, but.
Either Lauren or I can facilitate it. I don't think we have to worry
Okay.
about that, as long as you can make sure that they're available.
Mhm.
yeah,
We
and
could do
And review the questions.
4:30 or something?
4:30 and then make sure that we have that half-hour buffer
yeah, that
or
works.
6.
Can everybody do that? Amy, can you do that with work?
Oh, yeah, I changed my hours. I'm out at 3.
Congratulations.
Got my life back.
So June 4th at 4:30. Here,
Yes.
Yes, sir,
for
As long as
a
you
second
serve
half
David and
hour.
I some birthday cake.
yeah,
Okay.
second half hour.
Both you say share a birthday?
Well, his is a day before mine.
Yeah, mine's the 3rd.
Oh, yours day after mine.
So 4:30?
Yes, yeah,
Actually, I have a posting.
okay, does anybody have anything else relative to the candidates to discuss right now?
Motion?
I was gonna do a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Can I,
Sorry.
would you be,
Administrator?
would you be amenable to, me reaching out to say, department heads, staff, anybody who's watched the interviews to get any of their input?
I would be happy if you would do that.
Yeah, the more the merrier. I mean,
And
the
then will you
day-to-day.
give us-
Anybody that's watching on Zoom that has any
What's that?
input,
will you give us that feedback before the meeting?
yeah, I
I think I can do that. right?
Yeah, because,
A non-reply email to us.
we're gonna need, we've got to get our questions together. When do you need our stuff to you, John, so that you can formulate your
I
questions?
just can't reply.
As soon as, within 2-3 days, before the weekend.
Okay,
But having made that offer, I just feel compelled to say out loud that it's a select board decision.
Correct.
It's not, I like
It-
this personality better than the other. I mean, there has to be,
Right, department head.
yeah,
That's kind of what we've run into.
yeah, that's what, well, that's what I figured. I'm just looking for any information that we can digest and decide if it is helpful or not.
I just don't want people to be angry. But if we go in a different direction.
Guidance.
That's okay.
I'll add that to the email when I send it out and ask for.
No
for
anger
input.
is allowed.
This person is like-
Well,
Okay,
there's a motion and a second.
okay, we have a motion and a second to adjourn. Any further discussion?
So your meeting is canceled tomorrow night?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.